Friedrich Nietzsche, The Will to Power and the Death of God. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that everything you've ever believed in, every law, every tradition, every moral code, was built on a lie. That was the world Friedrich Nietzsche saw. A world where, in his words, God is dead and we have killed him. But Nietzsche wasn't talking about a literal God. He was talking about something far bigger, the entire foundation of human values. For centuries, morality had been built on religion, on divine rules, handed down from above. But what happens when faith crumbles? What happens when people stop believing? To Nietzsche, the answer was terrifying. Without an absolute moral authority, society would drift into chaos, nihilism, and despair. Yet, in that darkness, he saw something else. A challenge. If there is no higher meaning, then meaning must come from within. Enter the will to power, Nietzsche's boldest idea. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about strength. It was about the relentless pursuit of greatness. To him, the most powerful force in human nature was not the will to survive, but the will to create, to overcome, to rise above. But what did that mean for morality? If there were no divine laws, how should people live? Nietzsche attacked what he called slave morality, a mindset of weakness, humility, and submission. To him, society had been poisoned by ideals that glorified suffering and obedience. Instead, he called for a new kind of person, the Übermensch, the one who writes their own values, creates their own destiny, and refuses to be shackled by old ideas. This was dangerous thinking, revolutionary. To many, it sounded like a call for chaos, for a world where the strong trample the weak, and yet Nietzsche's ideas weren't meant to be taken so simply. His words weren't instructions, they were warnings. He wasn't telling people to destroy morality. He was asking, if the old gods are gone, what will you build in their place? Of course, Nietzsche's vision wasn't embraced in his lifetime. His work was misunderstood, distorted, twisted into something he never intended. Some even claim his ideas were co-opted by regimes that would horrify him. But that is the risk of philosophy. Once an idea is unleashed, it takes on a life of its own. And with that, we move from the destroyer of old values to the man who sought to build an entirely new reality. One of shadows and illusions, a world where truth itself was questioned, Plato. Plato, the theory of forms, and the Republic. What if everything you see, touch, and experience isn't real? Not in the way you think, at least. Imagine spending your entire life in a shadowy cave, chained in place, staring at a wall. The only reality you know comes from flickering shadows cast by a fire behind you. You've never seen the outside world, never even imagined it exists. Then, one day, you're freed. You step outside for the first time, and the truth blinds you. The shadows were never real. They were just distorted echoes of something greater, of a reality beyond anything you had ever known. This is Plato's allegory of the cave, one of the most famous thought experiments in all of philosophy. But it's more than just a story. To Plato, it was the key to understanding everything. He believed that the world we see, the physical world, isn't the real world. It's just a reflection, an imperfect copy of something greater. Beyond what we can see lies a deeper, purer reality, the world of forms, a realm where everything exists in its perfect, unchanging state. Think about a circle. In the physical world, you can draw one, but no matter how precise you are, it will never be a perfect circle. Yet in your mind, you can imagine a perfect circle, one with no flaws, no inconsistencies. That perfect circle, according to Plato, exists in the world of forms. It's real, but in a way that we can't physically grasp. This idea shaped everything Plato believed. He argued that the highest goal of philosophy wasn't just to study the world around us, it was to seek the truth hidden behind it. The world of forms was pure, eternal, and unchanging, and the job of the philosopher was to escape the cave of illusions and reach for that higher truth. But Plato didn't just stop at abstract ideas. He wanted to change the world itself. In his book The Republic, he outlined his vision for the perfect society. A world ruled not by the rich, not by the strongest, but by philosopher kings, those who had escaped the cave and seen the truth. They alone, Plato argued, had the wisdom to guide society toward justice. To modern ears, this sounds radical, even dangerous. A world ruled by an intellectual elite. A society where people's roles were chosen for them based on their nature. Plato's Republic wasn't democracy. It was a system where every person had their place, whether they liked it or not. Yet, despite its controversy, Plato's influence is everywhere. His ideas laid the foundation for political theory, ethics, and even modern psychology. His student, Aristotle, would challenge some of his ideas, but never escape his influence. Even today, we still wrestle with his questions: what is truth? What is justice? How should society be governed? And so, from a man who saw a hidden world beyond our senses, we move to one who grounded philosophy in the reality of human action. Plato gave us idealism. His student, Aristotle, gave us something else: practical wisdom. Aristotle, virtue, ethics, and the golden mean. Plato built a world of perfect forms. But Aristotle, he looked at the world as it is. No hidden realms, no ideal societies, just people, living, choosing, struggling. And to him, philosophy wasn't about escaping reality, it was about mastering it. If you want to live a good life, Aristotle argued, you don't need divine rules or abstract ideals. What you need is virtue, but not in the way most people think of it. To Aristotle, virtue wasn't about following commandments or living by rigid moral laws. It was about balance. Take courage. Too little, and you're a coward. Too much, and you're reckless. True courage lies somewhere in between. The same goes for ambition. Too little, and you waste your potential. Too much, and you become consumed by greed. This idea became the foundation of Aristotle's virtue ethics, the belief that a good life isn't about rigid rules, but about developing good character through moderation, wisdom, and habit. He called this balance the golden mean, the sweet spot between excess and deficiency. But how do we find this balance? Aristotle didn't believe that people were born virtuous. Instead, he saw virtue as something that had to be practiced, refined, and built over time. Just like a musician hones their craft or an athlete trains their body, a good person shapes their character through action. And this wasn't just about personal morality. It applied to politics too. Unlike Plato, who dreamed of philosopher kings ruling an ideal city, Aristotle believed that government should reflect the needs of the people. He studied different systems, weighing their strengths and weaknesses, and argued that the best government was one that balanced democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy, a system that could adapt, evolve, and serve the greater good. But Aristotle's philosophy wasn't just about society or ethics. He was obsessed with understanding everything. Science, logic, biology, poetry, no subject was beyond his reach. While Plato looked at the unseen, Aristotle examined the details of the world itself. He classified plants and animals, studied motion, developed rules for logic, and laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the scientific method. To Aristotle, philosophy wasn't about chasing some unreachable ideal. It was about making sense of the world, here and now. His ideas weren't just for scholars. They were for rulers, artists, merchants, and soldiers, a blueprint for living well, thinking clearly, and building a just society. And though his work shaped the foundations of Western thought, he was far from the only thinker reshaping human wisdom. On the other side of the world, another philosopher was doing the same, but in a completely different way. Where Aristotle built his philosophy on reason and observation, Confucius built his on relationships, tradition, and moral duty. Confucius, the Analects, and moral harmony. What makes a good person? What makes a good society? In the West, philosophers like Aristotle sought answers through reason and observation. But in ancient China, One man believed the key wasn't in laws or logic, but in something far more personal: relationships. His name was Confucius, and his philosophy didn't start in the heavens or in abstract ideas. It started in the home, in the family, in the everyday rituals of life. He believed that harmony wasn't something you imposed, it was something you cultivated. To Confucius, everything in life was built on 5 fundamental relationships: 1. Ruler and subject. 2. Parent and child. 3. Husband and wife. 4. Older sibling and younger sibling. 5. Friend and friend. These weren't just social structures, they were the foundation of morality itself. If people respected their roles, fulfilled their duties, and upheld tradition, then society would run smoothly. Chaos wasn't the result of bad laws, it was the result of people failing to act with honor, humility, and responsibility. At the heart of his teachings was the idea of Ren, humanness, kindness, and virtue. A good ruler wasn't one who ruled through fear, but one who ruled through moral example. A good son wasn't just obedient, he was devoted, honoring his parents in life and in death. A good person wasn't just intelligent, they were ethical, respectful, and disciplined. Confucius believed that learning wasn't just about knowledge, it was about self-cultivation. He once said, "To see what is right and not do it is the want of courage." Wisdom wasn't enough. Virtue had to be lived, practiced, and embodied. But Confucianism wasn't just about personal conduct. It was a blueprint for government, education, and social order. A ruler who lacked virtue would lose the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. A society that abandoned its traditions would descend into disorder. Yet, despite his influence, Confucius never saw his philosophy take hold in his lifetime. He spent years traveling from state to state, offering his wisdom to rulers, most of whom ignored him. He died believing he had failed. But his teachings lived on, preserved by his students in a collection known as the Analects. And over time, those teachings reshaped Chinese civilization. Dynasties built their governments on his philosophy. His ideas became the foundation of education, law, and ethics. And even today, his wisdom echoes across cultures, shaping how millions think about family, duty, and leadership. But while Confucius saw order in tradition, another thinker saw wisdom in something else: letting go. While Confucianism was about duty and discipline, Lao Tzu and Taoism were about surrendering to the flow of nature. Lao Tzu, Taoism, Wu Wei, and the Tao Te Ching. A river does not force its way forward. It bends, twists, flows. It moves effortlessly, yet carves mountains. This, according to Lao Tzu, is the way of the universe. The way of the Tao. While Confucius sought order in structure, duty, and tradition, Lao Tzu saw wisdom in letting go. To him, life was not something to be controlled. It was something to be lived in harmony with the natural flow of existence. The more we try to grasp, the more we lose. The more we fight, the more we suffer. His philosophy, known as Taoism, is rooted in a single elusive idea: the Tao, often translated as the way. The Tao is the underlying force of the universe, the flow of nature, the balance of all things. It is neither good nor bad, neither strong nor weak. It simply is. And the secret to a good life? Wu Wei. Effortless action. Not laziness, not passivity, but the ability to move with the current rather than against it. A tree that resists the wind breaks. A tree that bends with it survives. The strongest warrior, Lao Tzu said, is the one who knows when not to fight. This idea runs through every page of the Tao Te Ching, the foundational text of Taoism. Written in short, poetic verses, it offers wisdom not through rigid doctrines, but through paradoxes and metaphors. The softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest. When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be. The best leaders are those the people barely know exist. Taoism rejects the need for strict rules, rigid philosophies, or absolute truths. It embraces uncertainty, flexibility, and spontaneity. It tells us that we don't have to force solutions. Sometimes the answer is to step back and allow things to unfold. Epicurus, seeking tranquility and simple pleasures. What if the secret to happiness wasn't wealth, power, or fame, but something much simpler, a quiet life, a warm meal, and a few good friends? This was the radical idea of Epicurus, a philosopher who turned his back on politics, ambition, and the chaos of public life. While others debated power and morality, he built a garden, a literal one, where he and his followers lived, studied, and sought the one thing every human truly desires: peace of mind. But Epicurus wasn't a hedonist in the way people often imagine. To him, pleasure wasn't about indulgence. It was about freedom from pain. He believed that the greatest pleasures were not extravagant feasts or wild excess, but simple contentment. A cup of water when thirsty, a meal when hungry, a conversation with a friend. At the heart of his philosophy was ataraxia, a state of deep, unshakable tranquility. To achieve this, Epicurus argued, we must remove fear, unnecessary desires, and illusions. He saw three main obstacles to happiness. 1. The fear of gods. Epicurus believed that gods, if they existed, had no concern for human affairs. They neither punished nor rewarded people, so living in fear of divine wrath was pointless. 2. The fear of death. Death, he said, is nothing to fear, because when we are alive, death is not here. And when death comes, we are no longer here to experience it. 3. The pursuit of unnecessary desires, wealth, status, luxury. None of these bring lasting happiness. The simplest life is often the most fulfilling. His ideas were shocking to many. He rejected religious superstition. He dismissed politics as a waste of time. And he welcomed women and slaves as equals in his school, something unheard of in his time. But while Epicurus preached simplicity, his ideas were misunderstood, distorted, and attacked. His enemies claimed he promoted reckless pleasure-seeking, equating him with excess and indulgence. But true Epicureanism was never about chasing pleasure. It was about understanding which pleasures were worth chasing. His teachings would go on to influence science, ethics, and psychology, shaping how people think about happiness itself. And though his philosophy was grounded in serenity, his ideas carried echoes of something much older, another school of thought that sought a different kind of peace. Where Epicurus found tranquility and pleasure, Zeno of Citium found it in discipline, reason, and resilience. From the quiet gardens of Epicurus, we now move to the foundations of Stoicism. Zeno of Citium, the foundations of Stoicism. Imagine losing everything. Your home, your wealth, your security, gone in an instant. For most, this would be a tragedy. But for Zeno of Citium, it was the beginning of something greater. Once a wealthy merchant, Zeno's life fell apart when a shipwreck destroyed his fortune. He found himself stranded in Athens, a man with nothing, but instead of drowning in despair, he walked into a bookshop, picked up a text about Socrates, and discovered an idea that would change his life and the lives of countless others. That idea was Stoicism. To Zeno, suffering didn't come from external events. It came from how we respond to them. Fortune rises and falls. Life is unpredictable. But one thing remains in our control: our own mind. At the core of Stoicism was one simple truth: we do not control the world, we only control ourselves. A Stoic does not waste time fearing death, mourning lost wealth, or raging against fate. Instead, they focus on what they can change: their thoughts, their actions, their character. Zeno's philosophy taught that a good life was not about chasing pleasure or avoiding pain, but about living with wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline. These became the four cardinal virtues of Stoicism, a way of thinking that would influence some of history's greatest minds, from Roman emperors to modern thinkers. Zeno didn't just teach this philosophy, he lived it. He had no grand temple, no ivory tower. He taught in the streets, in the open air, speaking to anyone who would listen. His followers became known as the Stoics, named after the Stoa, a public colonnade where he held his discussions. But while Zeno laid the foundation of Stoicism, it would be others, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, who would refine and spread it, turning it into one of the most enduring schools of thought in history. And though Stoicism teaches resilience, discipline, and logic, one of its greatest rivals rejected logic entirely. Instead of careful reasoning, Pyrrho of Elis believed the wisest thing to do was doubt everything. Pyrrho of Elis, Skepticism, and the limits of human knowledge. What if everything you believe is wrong? Not just some things, all things. What if truth itself is unknowable, and certainty is nothing more than an illusion? This was the radical belief of Pyrrho of Elis, the father of skepticism. While other philosophers sought knowledge, Pyrrho questioned whether knowledge was even possible. Where the Stoics taught self-discipline, where Aristotle sought balance, Pyrrho believed the only true wisdom was realizing that we know nothing for certain. According to Pyrrho, the world is chaotic, full of contradictions, and filtered through our flawed perceptions. We think we understand it, but how can we be sure? Our senses deceive us. Our reasoning is limited. Even our deepest convictions are shaped by culture, experience, and bias. How, then, can we ever claim to know the truth? For Pyrrho, the answer was simple. We can't. And because of this, the best way to live was not to seek absolute truth, but to suspend judgment. This idea became the foundation of Pyrrhonism, the first true school of skepticism. Pyrrho argued that instead of endlessly debating what is real and what is not, we should simply stop worrying about it. Instead of clinging to certainty, we should embrace apoki, a state of suspended belief, where we no longer insist that we are right or that others are wrong. And what does this lead to? Ataraxia, peace of mind. By freeing ourselves from the illusion of certainty, we let go of anxiety, fear, and conflict. Pyrrho himself lived this philosophy to its extreme. According to legend, he refused to trust his own senses, needing friends to physically guide him away from cliffs and oncoming carts. His ideas shocked many, yet they planted the seeds of later skepticism, influencing thinkers like David Hume, Descartes, and even modern science. Today, skepticism is the backbone of the scientific method, the idea that we must constantly test, question, and doubt rather than accept things at face value. But while Pyrrho believed doubt was the key to tranquility, another philosopher rejected peace altogether. Instead of questioning reality, Diogenes of Sinope laughed in its face. Diogenes of Sinope, Cynicism and the Rejection of Society. Imagine walking through a crowded marketplace, holding a lantern in broad daylight. When people ask what you're doing, you say, "I'm looking for an honest man." That was Diogenes, a philosopher who rejected wealth, power, and even basic social norms, not out of ignorance but as a form of rebellion. While Pyrrho doubted reality, Diogenes mocked it. He was the founder of Cynicism, a school of thought that saw society as corrupt, artificial, and full of hypocrisy. Instead of chasing wealth, respect, or political power, Diogenes believed the best life was one free from all unnecessary desires. To him, the only way to be truly happy was to reject everything artificial and return to a simple, natural existence. And he didn't just preach this philosophy, he lived it. Diogenes abandoned possessions, lived in a barrel, and begged for food in the streets of Athens. He scorned social customs, mocked famous philosophers, and tested the limits of human shamelessness. When told not to eat in public, he responded, "If eating is not shameful, why should it be shameful to eat in the marketplace?" When people pitied him for his poverty, he replied, "I am not poor, I am free." Perhaps his most famous moment came when he met Alexander the Great. The emperor, fascinated by this strange man, offered him anything he desired. Diogenes didn't bow, didn't flatter, didn't even thank him. Instead, he simply said, "Step aside, you're blocking my sunlight." To Diogenes, wealth, status, and political power were all distractions. He mocked authority, exposed hypocrisy, and refused to play by the rules. And while his behavior shocked many, his ideas were powerful. Cynicism would go on to influence Stoicism, early Christianity, and even modern minimalist movements. Yet, while Diogenes found freedom in rejecting society, another thinker sought to master it. A philosopher who didn't mock power, but studied it, who didn't reject the world, but sought to control it. Chrysippus, the great Stoic logician. Chrysippus, Stoic logic, and the mastery of fate. What if everything in your life, every choice, every action, every event was already determined? No matter what you do, the outcome is inevitable. Would you fight against it, or would you embrace it? For Chrysippus, one of the greatest Stoic philosophers, the answer was clear: embrace it. While Zeno of Citium founded Stoicism, it was Chrysippus who built it into a complete system of logic, physics, and ethics. If Zeno laid the foundation, Chrysippus was the architect who turned Stoicism into one of the most powerful schools of thought in history. At the heart of his philosophy was determinism, the idea that everything follows a chain of cause and effect. The universe is rational, ordered, and governed by unbreakable laws. Nothing happens by chance. Every event is linked to the past, and every future event is already written. To many, this idea was terrifying. If fate controls everything, do we even have free will? Chrysippus's answer was yes, but not in the way most people think. He compared human choice to a rolling cylinder. Imagine a ball sitting on a slope. If you push it, it will roll. The push was necessary, but so was the ball's own shape. In the same way, external events may set things in motion, but how we respond to them depends on our nature, our character, and our choices. This became one of Stoicism's most profound lessons. We cannot control events, but we can control how we react to them. And to control our reactions, we must master our minds. This is where Chrysippus revolutionized Stoicism. He introduced formal logic, refining rules of reasoning that would influence philosophy for centuries. He believed that clear thinking leads to clear action and that irrational emotions, desires, and fears only cloud the mind. But even for the most rational Stoic, life was full of hardship. The universe was indifferent to human suffering. So how did Chrysippus handle this? Through amor fati, loving one's fate. If an event is beyond your control, accept it, embrace it, love it. Instead of resisting reality, align yourself with it. This was not about passivity, it was about strength. It was about training the mind to remain calm, no matter what life brings. Chrysippus's ideas would shape Stoicism for centuries, influencing great thinkers like Epicurus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. And while Stoicism sought to control the self, another philosophy sought to control everything, even the forces of the divine. Where the Stoics embraced fate, Augustine of Hippo wrestled with it. From the rational order of Stoicism, we now enter the realm of faith, sin, and salvation. Augustine of Hippo, the struggle between faith and reason. What if the deepest truths of life could never be proven? What if reason alone could never answer the biggest questions about existence, morality, or the purpose of the universe? For Augustine of Hippo, this was not just a philosophical question, it was the defining struggle of his life. A man caught between two worlds, faith and reason, philosophy and religion, the flesh and the soul. Born in the 4th century, Augustine was deeply influenced by Plato's idealism, Aristotle's logic, and the Stoic pursuit of self-mastery. Yet none of these gave him what he truly sought, a sense of meaning. He spent years searching, debating, questioning. He explored Manichaeism, a religious movement that saw the world as a battlefield between light and darkness. He studied Neoplatonism, which taught that everything emanates from a single divine source, but nothing satisfied him. Nothing gave him peace. That is, until he turned to Christianity. But Augustine wasn't a blind believer. He wrestled with faith, the way a philosopher wrestles with logic. He needed reason to justify belief. And so, he set out to do what few had done before, combine the logic of the ancient world with the faith of Christianity. One of his greatest struggles was with free will and the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does evil exist? Why do people suffer? Why do the wicked prosper while the righteous fall? Augustine's answer was groundbreaking. Evil, he argued, is not a thing. It is an absence. Just as darkness is the absence of light, evil is the absence of goodness. God, he believed, gave humans free will, and with free will comes the possibility of turning away from good. This idea would become one of the most influential Christian doctrines, shaping centuries of theological thought. Yet Augustine's struggles didn't end there. He believed that faith and reason were not enemies, but partners. Reason could take you far, but there was a point where logic failed, where only faith could fill the gap. In his famous work, The Confessions, Augustine laid bare his spiritual journey, his doubts, his sins, and his ultimate realization. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. His writings would become the foundation of medieval philosophy, influencing thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and shaping the direction of Western thought for centuries. And while Augustine tried to reconcile faith with reason, others would take a different path, one that sought to explain the universe purely through logic and science. From the world of faith, we now step into the world of Boethius, a man who faced death with nothing but philosophy as his guide. Boethius, the consolation of philosophy. What do you cling to when everything is taken from you? When fortune turns against you, when your wealth, status, and freedom are gone, what remains? For Boethius, the answer was philosophy. Once a powerful Roman official, Boethius was at the height of his influence when he was betrayed, accused of treason, and imprisoned. He had served emperors, shaped laws, and lived a life of privilege, but none of it mattered now. Sitting alone in a cold prison cell, awaiting execution, he had nothing left but his thoughts. And so he turned inward. Instead of despairing, he wrote. What emerged was one of the most profound philosophical works in history, The Consolation of Philosophy. In it, Boethius imagines a conversation between himself and Lady Philosophy, the personification of wisdom. She appears to him in his darkest moment, not to offer comfort, but to challenge him. She asks, "Did you really think fortune was yours to keep? Did you think power, riches, and success would last forever?" She reminds him that fortune is fickle. It gives and takes at will, and those who trust in it are doomed to suffer when it inevitably turns. True happiness, she argues, can never come from external things. It must come from within. But Boethius isn't satisfied. He asks a deeper question. If the world is ruled by divine order, why do the wicked prosper while the good suffer? Why do tyrants rise while the just fall? Where is justice? Lady Philosophy answers with a concept that would influence centuries of thought, the idea of providence and fate. Fate is the ever-changing, unpredictable movement of the world, the ups and downs, the twists and turns of fortune. Providence is the higher order that governs everything, even when we can't see it. From our limited human perspective, the world looks chaotic. But if we could see it from above, we would realize that even suffering serves a purpose. Everything is part of a greater plan. But this doesn't mean we should sit idly by. Boethius believed that true happiness comes not from fortune, but from virtue, wisdom, and inner stability. A good person remains steady, no matter what happens. His ideas would bridge the ancient world and the medieval, influencing Christian theology, Renaissance humanism, and even modern Stoicism. He showed that philosophy was not just an academic pursuit, it was a lifeline, a way to endure the worst life could throw at you. And while Boethius sought solace in reason, another thinker took this question of divine justice even further. From a Roman prison cell, we now travel to the world of Islam's golden age, to Avicenna and the nature of the soul. Avicenna, Islamic metaphysics and the nature of the soul. If you were born in total isolation, no people, no voices, no sight, no touch, would you still know that you exist? This was the question posed by Avicenna, one of the most influential thinkers of the Islamic Golden Age. Known in the West as the father of early modern philosophy, Avicenna blended Aristotelian logic, Neoplatonic metaphysics, and Islamic theology to create a system of thought that would shape philosophy, medicine, and science for centuries. At the heart of his philosophy was the nature of the soul. To prove that the self exists independently of the body, he proposed a famous thought experiment, the floating man. Imagine a person created, fully formed, floating in empty space. No senses, no experience, no external world. Would this person still be aware of themselves? Avicenna argued that yes, they would. Even without sight, sound, or touch, they would still know in some deep way that they exist. This was his proof of the soul's independent existence. The self, he argued, is not just a collection of physical sensations. It is something deeper, something fundamental, something immaterial. But Avicenna was not just a metaphysician. He was a scientist, a physician, a polymath. His greatest work, the Book of Healing, was a vast encyclopedia that covered logic, physics, medicine, and philosophy, blending Aristotelian reason with Islamic thought. One of his most radical ideas was the distinction between essence and existence. He argued that things have two aspects. 1. Essence, what something is. 2. Existence, whether that thing actually exists in reality. A unicorn has an essence. We can imagine it, define it, even describe its properties. But it does not have existence because it is not real. This led to one of Avicenna's greatest contributions to metaphysics, his proof of God as the necessary existent. He argued that everything in the universe is contingent. It could either exist or not exist, but something must exist necessarily without dependence on anything else. This, he claimed, was God, the one being whose essence and existence are the same. His ideas were revolutionary, influencing Christian, Jewish, and Islamic philosophy alike. Thomas Aquinas would later borrow heavily from Avicenna's arguments, and his works would be studied throughout medieval Europe. Yet while Avicenna saw reason and faith as intertwined, another thinker, Averroes, would take a more radical stance. He would go even further, arguing that reason should be the ultimate guide to truth, even above religious doctrine. And so, from the world of metaphysics, we now step into the world of rationalism, science, and the limits of religious authority. Averroes, the relationship between reason and faith. What happens when faith and reason collide? When science contradicts scripture, or when logic challenges belief, what should prevail? For Averroes, the answer was clear. Reason is the highest path to truth. Living in 12th century Islamic Spain, Averroes, also known as Ibn Rushd, was a philosopher, jurist, and physician who sought to bridge the gap between philosophy and religion. But unlike Avicenna, who harmonized reason with faith, Averroes took a bolder, more radical stance. He argued that where reason and religious texts seemed to conflict, reason should take precedence. This was a dangerous idea. In an age where religious doctrine ruled over knowledge, Averroes dared to say that truth could be found outside of Scripture. His belief was rooted in the philosophy of Aristotle, whom he saw as the ultimate authority on rational thought. Averroes devoted much of his life to writing commentaries on Aristotle, defending logic and scientific inquiry against religious dogma. He argued that the Quran itself encouraged rational thought and that those capable of philosophical reasoning had a duty to interpret religious texts allegorically rather than literally. But this raised a troubling question. If philosophy is for the rational elite, what about everyone else? Averroes proposed a three-tiered model of knowledge. First, the masses. They understand religious teachings through simple stories and allegories. Second, the theologians. They interpret scripture through debate and dialectic reasoning. And third, the philosophers. They seek truth through pure reason and should not be bound by religious literalism. To Averroes, this meant that not everyone needed to engage in philosophy, only those capable of deep rational thought. But this idea was dangerous. By dividing society into levels of understanding, he threatened the religious authorities who relied on dogma to maintain control. And so he was condemned. His works were banned, burned, and rejected in the Islamic world. But ironically, while his ideas were suppressed in his homeland, they flourished in Europe. His writings on Aristotle were translated into Latin and studied by Christian scholars, including Thomas Aquinas, who would later use them to shape Catholic theology. Averroes's legacy was one of paradox. A Muslim philosopher whose ideas influenced Christian thought more than his own culture. A man who sought to unite reason and faith, yet was exiled for trying. And a thinker who, centuries before the Enlightenment, dared to say that logic should not bow to belief. Yet while Averroes championed reason, another thinker took a different approach. Instead of relying on philosophy alone, he sought wisdom in religious law, tradition, and the study of Jewish thought. Moses Maimonides. Moses Maimonides, the guide for the perplexed. What happens when faith itself becomes confusing? When scripture and philosophy seem to contradict each other, when religious teachings clash with reason, how does one find clarity? For Moses Maimonides, the answer lay in understanding that truth is not always simple. A Jewish philosopher, theologian, and physician of the 12th century, Maimonides lived in a time of intellectual conflict. Religious texts were taken literally, yet philosophy and science were rapidly advancing. To many, these two worlds seemed irreconcilable. But Maimonides believed that faith and reason were not enemies. They were two sides of the same truth. His masterpiece, The Guide for the Perplexed, was written for those who struggled to reconcile rational philosophy with religious belief. It was aimed at the thinkers, the doubters, those caught between tradition and logic, those who, as he described, were perplexed. One of his boldest arguments was that many biblical stories should not be taken literally. When Scripture describes God as angry, jealous, or walking among men, these are not actual traits of God. They are metaphors written in a way that ordinary people could understand. To Maimonides, God was beyond human emotions, beyond physical form, beyond anything we could fully grasp. And yet, he argued, this does not mean we should abandon rational thought. Like Aristotle before him, he believed that human reason is our greatest tool for understanding the world. He rejected blind faith, urging believers to seek knowledge, to question, to use logic to deepen their understanding of divine truth. But this approach came with controversy. Religious authorities feared that Maimonides' teachings would lead people away from faith. Some viewed his insistence on rationalism as dangerous, a slippery slope that could weaken religious commitment. And much like Averroes before him, his writings were burned by those who saw them as heretical. Yet over time, his influence grew rather than faded. His ideas shaped Jewish thought for centuries, influencing not just theologians, but scientists, ethicists, and legal scholars. He paved the way for a more intellectual, philosophical approach to religion, one that embraced questioning rather than feared it. But while Maimonides sought harmony between faith and reason, another thinker sought to define the very laws of nature itself. From theology, we now step into the world of William of Ockham and the principle that would shape modern science, Occam's razor. William of Ockham, Occam's razor and the power of simplicity. What if the truth is simpler than we think? What if in our search for knowledge, we make things far more complicated than they need to be? For William of Ockham, a 14th-century English philosopher and theologian, complexity was the enemy of clarity. At a time when scholars layered philosophy with grand, intricate explanations of the universe, Ockham dared to cut through the noise. His tool, a simple principle that would change the way we think forever. That principle is now known as Occam's razor. Entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. In other words, the simplest explanation is usually the best one. If two competing theories explain something equally well, the one with fewer assumptions, fewer unnecessary steps, and less complexity is more likely to be true. Occam wasn't the first to value simplicity in reasoning, but he was the first to formalize it as a rule of logic. He applied it to theology, science, and philosophy, arguing that we should not add extra causes or explanations when a simpler one suffices. For example, if the wind blows a door shut, do we need to assume ghosts were involved? If a disease spreads, should we assume divine punishment or a natural cause? If planets move through the sky, should we invent invisible spheres to guide them or look for a simpler answer? Though Occam himself remained a theologian, his principle would lay the groundwork for modern science. Centuries later, astronomers, physicists, and mathematicians would use Occam's razor to strip away outdated theories and find truth through simplicity. But Occam's ideas weren't just about science. They were also about power. He challenged the authority of the church, arguing that religious and political institutions should not claim powers they could not justify. He fought against excessive dogma, unnecessary traditions, and elaborate justifications for control. This made him dangerous. Excommunicated and forced into exile, he spent the last years of his life writing fiercely against the corruption of religious and political leaders. But his ideas lived on, spreading far beyond theology. Occam's razor is now one of the most fundamental rules of logic and science. From physics to medicine, from artificial intelligence to detective work, the principle remains the same. Do not make things more complicated than they need to be. And yet, while Occam sought to simplify knowledge, another thinker sought to define the very essence of reality itself. From logic and simplicity, we now step into the towering metaphysics of Duns Scotus and the search for universals. Duns Scotus, the problem of universals and the nature of being. What does it mean to exist? Not just as an individual, but as a concept, as a category, as something that can be named and known. For Duns Scotus, a 13th century philosopher and theologian, this was not just a question of words, it was a question of reality itself. His work would reshape metaphysics, theology, and the very way we define existence. At the heart of his philosophy was the problem of universals, one of the most debated questions in medieval thought. Imagine two apples. They are different objects, yet we call them both apples. But what does that mean? Is appleness something real that exists beyond individual apples, or is it just a name we give to things that look similar? Previous thinkers had taken sides in this debate. Plato argued that universals were real, existing in a higher realm of perfect forms. Aristotle took a more grounded approach, saying that universals existed, but only within individual things. William of Ockham, whom we just discussed, took an extreme stance, rejecting universals entirely, arguing that they were just names, labels we place on objects with no real existence of their own. Scotus, however, carved a new path. He rejected Plato's extreme idealism, but also dismissed Occam's radical skepticism. Instead, he proposed that universals exist, but they exist in a different way than individual things. They are not separate entities floating somewhere beyond reality, but they are not meaningless labels either. They are real aspects of things, embedded within them, part of their fundamental nature. This led to his concept of hexity, a term that means thisness. According to Scotus, what makes a thing unique is not just its universal qualities, being an apple, being red, being round, but something deeper, its thisness, the specific reality of being this apple and no other. But Scotus's philosophy wasn't just about logic, it was about faith. He argued for the absolute uniqueness of God, defining him as the most real being, a necessary existence, beyond all limitations. His views on God's will influenced centuries of theology, shaping the debates between free will and determinism, divine simplicity, and the nature of moral law. Yet while Scotus sought to define what makes something truly real, another thinker focused on the sharpest tool of philosophy, doubt. From defining the nature of existence, we now move to René Descartes and the most famous statement in philosophy, I think, therefore I am. René Descartes, Cartesian dualism, and the search for certainty. What if everything you believe about the world, about your senses, about reality itself, was an illusion? For René Descartes, this wasn't just a thought experiment. It was a genuine fear. A fear that everything he had ever known might be false, and that certainty itself was impossible. To escape this doubt, Descartes did something radical. He questioned everything. He imagined a world where all his senses deceived him, where every sight, every sound, every touch was an illusion. What if the world around him was nothing but a dream? Worse still, what if an all-powerful, malevolent demon was manipulating his thoughts, feeding him false truths? If that were the case, how could he be sure of anything? And then, out of the darkness of doubt, he found one unshakable truth: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. No matter how much he doubted, no matter how deceptive reality might be, he could not doubt the fact that he was doubting. He could not question his own existence because the very act of questioning proved he existed. This became the foundation of Cartesian dualism, the idea that the mind and the body are separate, distinct substances. The body belongs to the physical world. It takes up space, follows the laws of nature, and can be doubted. The mind, however, is different. It does not take up space. It is not bound by physical laws. It is pure thought, pure consciousness, the one thing we can be absolutely certain of. This idea would reshape philosophy, science, and psychology. It laid the groundwork for modern discussions of consciousness, influencing thinkers for centuries. But it also created a new problem. If the mind and body are separate, how do they interact? How does an immaterial mind control a physical body? How do thoughts turn into actions? Descartes struggled with this question, suggesting that the pineal gland in the brain might be the bridge between the two realms. But even he knew this was only a partial answer. Despite this challenge, his method of radical doubt changed the course of philosophy forever. He demanded that knowledge be built on absolute certainty, leading to the birth of modern rationalism. His ideas influenced mathematics, science, and even artificial intelligence, where the question of mind versus machine still echoes today. And yet, while Descartes sought certainty in thought, another philosopher would take the opposite path. He would argue that thought alone is not enough, that true knowledge must come from experience, from the senses, from the world itself. From rationalism, we now turn to empiricism. And with that, we meet John Locke and the mind as a blank slate. John Locke, the blank slate, and the birth of empiricism. What if the mind is born empty, not filled with innate ideas, not pre-programmed with knowledge, but a blank slate waiting to be written on by experience? For John Locke, this was not just a theory. It was a revolutionary rejection of centuries of philosophical tradition. While thinkers like Plato and Descartes believed that certain truths were inborn, Locke argued that all knowledge comes from experience. This idea, known as empiricism, would change everything. Locke compared the mind to a tabula rasa, a blank slate. At birth, he claimed, we know nothing. No ideas of God, no understanding of morality, no concept of logic or mathematics. Everything we learn, every belief, every skill, every thought is etched onto the mind by experience. According to Locke, there are two ways we gain knowledge. First, sensation, what we perceive through the senses. Colors, shapes, sounds, textures, all are raw data about the world. Second, reflection, how we process and analyze our experiences. Memory, reasoning, and self-awareness. From these two sources, everything we know is built. This directly challenged Descartes' rationalism. While Descartes believed we could reach truth through thought alone, Locke insisted that without experience, thought has nothing to work with. And this wasn't just a theory about learning, it was a political statement. If people are born as blank slates, then they are not born inherently sinful or superior. There are no natural kings, no divine rulers, no predetermined social orders. Who you become depends on your environment, your education, your choices. This idea laid the foundation for modern democracy. Locke's work would inspire the American and French revolutions, shape the concept of human rights, and influence thinkers like Thomas Jefferson and Voltaire. But Locke's philosophy had an unintended consequence. If all knowledge comes from experience, how can we be sure that our senses are reliable? This question would lead to the most radical skeptic of all, David Hume, who would take empiricism to its breaking point. David Hume, The Problem of Induction and the Limits of Knowledge. What if everything you believe about the world is based on an illusion, not because of deception, but because of a flaw in the way we think? For David Hume, this flaw lay in something so basic, so unquestioned, that most people never even noticed it: induction, the idea that the future will resemble the past. Hume, an 18th-century Scottish philosopher, was a radical empiricist. He believed that all knowledge comes from experience. But this belief led him to a terrifying realization. We assume patterns exist, but we have no logical proof that they will continue. Take the sunrise. Every morning, the sun rises. We expect it to rise tomorrow because it always has before. But why? What guarantees that the future must follow the past? Just because the sun has risen every day before, does that mean it always will? Just because dropped objects have always fallen, does that mean they always must? Just because fire has always burned, does that mean it always will? Hume's answer: there is no rational proof that these patterns will continue. This is the problem of induction. We don't actually know that fire will always burn, that gravity will always pull, that the world will always behave the way it has before. We assume these things, but we cannot prove them. This wasn't just a small philosophical issue. It shook the very foundations of science, logic, and human reasoning. Because if Hume was right, then science itself, which is built on observing patterns and making predictions, had no rational foundation. Science assumes that cause and effect are real. But what if cause and effect is just a habit of thought? What if we only believe in it because we're used to it? Hume called this custom, the idea that our minds create expectations based on habit, not certainty. We don't see cause and effect, we just assume it because we've never seen otherwise. This was radical skepticism taken to its extreme. If we cannot trust induction, how can we trust any knowledge at all? And yet, despite his skepticism, Hume was not a nihilist. He didn't believe we should stop living or thinking. Instead, he argued that even though reason fails, we must rely on experience, probability, and instinct. His ideas would later influence Immanuel Kant, who was so shaken by Hume's skepticism that he wrote an entire system of philosophy to respond to it. And even today, scientists and philosophers still wrestle with the problem of induction. But while Hume tore down certainty, another thinker sought to rebuild it. Where Hume left us doubting everything, Immanuel Kant would try to give us back a foundation for knowledge. Immanuel Kant, Transcendental Idealism and the Limits of Human Knowledge. What if reality isn't what it seems? What if the world you experience, the colors you see, the sounds you hear, the objects you touch, is not reality itself, but merely a filtered version of it? For Immanuel Kant, this was the key to solving one of philosophy's greatest problems. He was deeply influenced by David Hume, who had shaken the foundations of knowledge with his radical skepticism. If all knowledge comes from experience, and experience is unreliable, can we ever know anything for certain? Kant believed we could, but not in the way most people assumed. He argued that the mind does not passively receive information from the world. It actively shapes it. What we experience isn't raw reality. It's a structured, processed version of reality, built by the mind itself. This idea became transcendental idealism, Kant's revolutionary theory about how we perceive the world. He made a bold distinction. 1. The phenomenal world. The world as we experience it, shaped by our senses and mind. 2. The noumenal world. The world as it truly is, independent of our perception. Kant argued that we can never truly know the noumenal world. Everything we perceive, the passage of time, the shapes of objects, the laws of causality, is not an inherent part of reality. It is a structure imposed by our minds. Think about space and time. We assume they exist as fundamental parts of reality. But according to Kant, space and time are not external things. They are ways in which our minds organize experience. Imagine wearing red-tinted glasses. Everything you see is red. But is the world actually red? Or is red just the lens through which you see it? Kant suggested that our minds work in the same way. We don't see reality directly. We see it through the lens of human cognition. This meant that Hume's skepticism was both right and wrong. Yes, we can never know the world as it is in itself, but that doesn't mean knowledge is impossible. Our minds impose order on the world, making knowledge possible, but only within the limits of human perception. Kant's ideas revolutionized metaphysics, epistemology, and even science. They influenced everything from modern psychology to quantum physics, where observers shape reality just by measuring it. But Kant's philosophy wasn't just about knowledge, it was also about morality. He believed that just as the mind imposes order on experience, reason imposes moral law on our actions. This led to one of his most famous ideas, the categorical imperative, a principle that determines right from wrong through pure reason. And with that, philosophy shifted from questions about reality to questions about morality, ethics, and how we should live. So now, from the nature of knowledge, we move to the nature of right and wrong. Enter Hegel and the dialectic of history. Hegel, the dialectic of history, and the march of ideas. What if history wasn't just a series of random events, but a process, a grand unfolding of ideas, each one building on the last, moving humanity towards something greater? For Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, history was not chaotic or directionless. It was a dialectical process, driven forward by contradictions, conflicts, and resolutions. Every era, every ideology, every movement was a step toward the next, shaping the evolution of human thought. This idea became known as Hegelian dialectics. He proposed that progress happens in a three-stage cycle. First, thesis, an idea or dominant belief system. Second, antithesis, a reaction that opposes and challenges the thesis. And third, synthesis, a resolution that emerges from the conflict, creating a new, higher understanding. This cycle repeats endlessly, driving history forward. Every revolution, every cultural shift, every intellectual breakthrough follows this pattern. Take feudalism, for example. Thesis, a rigid social structure where kings and nobles rule over serfs. Antithesis, the rise of the bourgeoisie and the demand for individual rights. Synthesis, the birth of modern democracy and capitalism. But Hegel didn't just apply this to politics. He saw it in art, religion, science, and philosophy itself. Human civilization, he argued, was on a journey toward greater self-awareness, reason, and freedom. And at the highest level, this dialectical movement was leading toward absolute spirit, a state where humanity fully understands itself, the universe, and the unfolding of history. This idea was profound. It suggested that ideas were more powerful than individuals, that history was not shaped by kings or generals, but by the struggle of concepts, by the push and pull of human understanding. But Hegel's philosophy was not without criticism. Some saw his dialectic as too deterministic, suggesting that history was moving toward a predestined goal. Others struggled with his dense, complex writing, which made his ideas difficult to interpret. Yet his influence was unparalleled. His work inspired Karl Marx, existentialists like Sartre and Kierkegaard, and even modern political theory. And while Hegel saw history as a grand unfolding of ideas, one of his most famous critics saw it in a completely different way. For Karl Marx, history wasn't about ideas at all. It was about class struggle, material conditions, and the fight between the rich and the poor. Karl Marx, historical materialism, and the struggle for power. What if history isn't shaped by ideas at all? What if everything, Wars, revolutions, political systems can be traced back to one simple force: money. For Karl Marx, history was not a battle of philosophies, as Hegel believed. It was a battle of class struggle, a relentless conflict between those who own wealth and those who don't, the rich and the poor, the rulers and the ruled, the oppressors and the oppressed. This idea became the foundation of historical materialism, the belief that economic forces drive history. According to Marx, every society throughout history has been built on a base, the economic structure that determines everything else. The economy, the way people produce goods, and who controls wealth, this is what shapes politics, religion, culture, and even morality. In feudalism, power belonged to the landowners, and peasants were forced to work for them. In capitalism, power belongs to the industrialists, and workers must sell their labor to survive. In socialism, power, Marx argued, would belong to the workers themselves. Each stage of history, he believed, followed a pattern of inequality, exploitation, and eventual revolution. Just as feudalism was replaced by capitalism, Marx predicted that capitalism would be replaced by communism, a system where wealth would be distributed fairly and the working class would no longer be exploited. But how would this happen? Through revolution. Marx argued that the capitalist system was built on an illusion that workers have freedom. In reality, he said, they are trapped in a cycle of wage labor, where their work enriches the few while they struggle to survive. He called this alienation, the separation of workers from the products of their own labor. And just like every ruling class before them, the capitalists would fight to hold on to power. But Marx believed that this fight was ultimately doomed to fail. The workers, the proletariat, would rise up, overthrow the system, and seize control of production. This wasn't just theory, it was a call to action. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Friedrich Engels famously declared, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle," and in its final lines, they issued a challenge that would echo for generations. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Marx's ideas were both revolutionary and controversial. Many saw him as a prophet of justice. Others saw him as a dangerous radical, but whether praised or condemned, his philosophy reshaped the world. His ideas influenced political revolutions, economic theories, and global movements, giving rise to everything from labor unions to socialist states. And even in societies that rejected communism, his critique of capitalism left a permanent mark on how we understand power, inequality, and economics. Yet, while Marx saw history as a struggle of class, another philosopher looked at morality itself, not through power, but through liberty. From revolution and materialism, we now turn to John Stuart Mill and the defense of individual freedom. John Stuart Mill, Individual Liberty and the Limits of Authority. What if the greatest danger to freedom isn't a tyrant, but the will of the majority? For John Stuart Mill, liberty was not just about overthrowing kings or resisting government oppression. The real threat to individual freedom, he warned, often comes from society itself. Born in the 19th century, Mill was deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, utilitarianism, and the rise of democracy. He believed that progress depended on individual thought, free expression, and the ability to challenge popular opinions. But unlike Karl Marx, who saw history as a struggle between classes, Mill saw history as a struggle between the individual and society. His greatest work, On Liberty, laid out one of the most influential defenses of personal freedom ever written. In it, he argued that there is only one justification for limiting an individual's freedom: to prevent harm to others. This became known as the harm principle, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others. Mill believed that liberty had its limits, but those limits were clear. Your right to swing your fist ends where another person's nose begins. In other words, you are free to do as you wish, to think what you like, to live however you see fit, but only as long as your actions do not cause harm to others. A society has no right to control personal beliefs, no right to dictate how someone lives, as long as their choices do not infringe upon the well-being of others. This, for Mill, was the cornerstone of true freedom. This was a radical idea. It meant that governments had no right to dictate personal morality, religion, or lifestyle. Laws against blasphemy, censorship of unpopular ideas, social pressure to conform. Mill saw all of these as forms of oppression. But he didn't stop at politics. He argued that free speech was not just a right, but a necessity. Even false ideas, he claimed, should be heard. Why? Because challenging bad ideas strengthens truth. If we suppress debate, even the best ideas become dogma, blindly accepted, not understood. Genius can only breathe freely in an atmosphere of freedom. Yet Mill was not an anarchist. He believed in democracy, but he also feared the tyranny of the majority. If public opinion became too powerful, it could crush individuality, silence dissent, and create a dull, conformist society. And this was where Mill's ideas diverged from pure utilitarianism. While Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism, argued that the goal of society was the greatest happiness for the greatest number, Mill warned that this could lead to a world where the majority tramples on the rights of the minority. His work influenced modern liberalism, human rights, and free speech movements. Today, his ideas form the backbone of democratic societies, shaping debates on censorship, government power, and personal autonomy. But while Mill defended individual freedom, another philosopher asked a much deeper question. Instead of debating how society should function, he asked, what does it mean to exist at all? From liberty and democracy, we now turn to Søren Kierkegaard and the birth of existentialism. Søren Kierkegaard, the birth of existentialism and the leap of faith. What if the most important truths in life couldn't be proven? What if logic, reason, and philosophy could only take you so far before you had to take a leap into the unknown? For Søren Kierkegaard, this wasn't just a philosophical question, it was a personal crisis. Born in early 19th century Denmark, Kierkegaard rejected the idea that truth was something abstract, something that could be neatly defined in books and lectures. He believed that truth was something lived, something felt, something deeply individual. And when it came to the biggest questions, faith, meaning, existence, he believed that reason alone was not enough. Kierkegaard saw a world obsessed with certainty. Philosophers like Hegel had built grand systems to explain history, morality, and human nature, treating truth like a puzzle that could be solved. But to Kierkegaard, this was an illusion. Life wasn't an equation, it was a personal struggle. And at the heart of this struggle was anguish. Kierkegaard believed that the modern world had left people spiritually empty. They followed religious traditions without truly believing in them. They accepted social norms without questioning them. They lived unexamined lives, hiding from the terrifying freedom of choice. But deep down, he argued, everyone felt it, that existential dread, that anxiety that comes with realizing that life has no clear meaning, no pre-written script. We are free to choose who we become, but with that freedom comes fear. And this is where Kierkegaard introduced one of his most famous ideas, the leap of faith. He argued that true belief is not built on logic or evidence. It is a leap, a decision made in the face of uncertainty. Take religious faith. Some philosophers tried to prove the existence of God through reason, through carefully crafted arguments. Kierkegaard rejected this entirely. Faith, he said, is not about certainty. It's about embracing the unknown. To believe is to take a leap, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because you choose to believe despite the uncertainty. This was a radical idea, and it would later inspire existentialist thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, but with one major difference. While Kierkegaard saw meaning in faith, later existentialists would seek meaning without it. And so, from Kierkegaard's struggle with belief, we move to another thinker who would take his ideas in a completely different direction. Instead of relying on God, tradition, or external values, he argued that meaning is something we must create for ourselves. From the tension of belief, we now move to Jean-Paul Sartre and radical freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre, radical freedom and bad faith. What if you had no excuses, no destiny, no divine plan, no pre-written path, only yourself, your choices, and the weight of total responsibility? For Jean-Paul Sartre, this wasn't just a philosophical idea, it was a radical demand. Born in early 20th century France, Sartre lived through the chaos of war, the collapse of old world views, and the rise of existential doubt. He saw a world where people clung to tradition, religion, or authority to avoid responsibility for their own existence, and he rejected all of it. His philosophy, Existentialism, argued that there is no fixed human nature, no grand purpose, no external force guiding us. Instead, we are thrown into the world, and from the moment we are conscious, we must define ourselves through our choices. This idea became radical freedom, the belief that we are completely responsible for who we become. Unlike Kierkegaard, who saw this freedom as terrifying and turned to faith, Sartre saw it as liberating. Without preordained meaning, we are free to create our own. But with this freedom came a burden, because if we are truly free, then we can no longer blame anything else for our choices. Not fate, not society, not our past. If we act cowardly, it is because we have chosen to be cowards. If we live inauthentically, it is because we have chosen to deceive ourselves. And this self-deception is what Sartre called bad faith. Imagine a waiter in a cafe, moving with exaggerated grace, playing the role of the waiter. He is not just serving coffee, he is performing, trying to become his job, convincing himself that he is nothing more than this role. This, Sartre argued, is bad faith, the act of denying our own freedom. We pretend that we are trapped, that we are defined by our circumstances, that we must behave a certain way. But this is a lie. For Sartre, the only honest way to live was in good faith, to accept our radical freedom and take full responsibility for who we are. No pre-made identity, no escape into social roles, no blaming fate. This was an idea that would shape literature, psychology, politics, and art. It influenced everything from existentialist novels to modern therapy, challenging people to confront who they really are beneath the masks they wear. But while Sartre demanded that we create meaning, another existentialist, Albert Camus, took this one step further. What if life has no meaning at all? What if existence itself is absurd? From radical freedom, we now step into the absurd and the myth of Sisyphus. Albert Camus, The Absurd and the Myth of Sisyphus. What if life had no meaning, no grand purpose, no cosmic order, just a silent, indifferent universe? Would that make existence unbearable, or would it make us truly free? For Albert Camus, this wasn't just a question, it was the defining conflict of human existence. Camus, a French philosopher and writer, was born into hardship, raised in poverty, and lived through the brutality of World War II. He saw firsthand how people searched for meaning in a world that seemed utterly indifferent to their suffering. Some turned to religion, others to politics. But Camus believed that all of these were just attempts to escape the truth, that life itself is absurd. The absurd was Camus' central idea, the contradiction between our deep desire for meaning and the universe's complete silence. Humans crave order, but the world gives us chaos. We seek purpose, but nature is indifferent. We look for justice, yet the universe operates without fairness. And yet, even in the face of this absurd, Camus did not fall into despair. Instead, he asked, how should we respond to a meaningless world? This question led him to his most famous work, The Myth of Sisyphus. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down again and again for eternity. No rest, no escape, a cycle of endless struggle. To Camus, This was the perfect image of human existence. We work, we strive, we seek meaning, only to be met with the same inevitable reality. Nothing lasts, nothing is permanent, nothing ultimately matters. So what should we do? Should we give up? Should we despair? No. Camus' answer was defiance. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Camus argued that accepting the absurd is not the end, it is the beginning of true freedom. Once we stop searching for external meaning, we can embrace life as it is, not because it has some grand purpose, but because we choose to live in full awareness of its absurdity. This is what Camus called revolt, not rebellion in the political sense, but a personal philosophical defiance, a refusal to give in to despair, to live despite the meaninglessness. His philosophy influenced everything from literature to psychology to existentialist ethics. It shaped modern absurdist art and theater, most famously in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. And yet, while Camus rejected religion, another philosopher took his ideas on existence in a different direction. Instead of embracing absurdity, he questioned whether we even had the right language to describe reality at all. From the absurd, we now move to Ludwig Wittgenstein and the limits of language. Ludwig Wittgenstein, Language Games and the Limits of Language. What if the biggest problems in philosophy weren't about existence, morality, or free will, but about words themselves? For Ludwig Wittgenstein, the limits of human thought weren't found in the mysteries of the universe, but in the language we use to describe it. He believed that many of philosophy's biggest questions weren't really questions at all, but illusions created by the way we use words. Born in Austria in the late 19th century, Wittgenstein was deeply influenced by logic, mathematics, and the early work of Bertrand Russell. He saw philosophy not as a search for truth, but as a battle against confusion. His first major work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, attempted to build a complete structure of logic, a way to perfectly describe the world through language. It ended with one of the most famous lines in philosophy, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." In other words, if something cannot be clearly expressed in language, it is beyond our ability to think about. For years, Wittgenstein believed this was the final word on philosophy, but later in life, he completely changed his mind. He realized that language isn't a rigid, logical structure. It's fluid, evolving, shaped by how people actually use it. Words don't get their meaning from definitions alone, but from context, behavior, and interaction. This led to his second great idea, language games. He argued that words work like pieces in a game. Their meaning depends on the rules we use them in. In chess, a pawn moves a certain way because the game says so. In the same way, words mean what they do because of the way we use them in everyday life. Think about the word truth. In science, it means one thing. In religion, something else. In everyday conversation, something different again. There is no single fixed meaning of truth that exists outside of these language games. This had profound consequences. If language shapes thought, then many philosophical problems are just misunderstandings of how words are used. Debates about the meaning of life or the nature of reality might be meaningless because they assume words have a fixed meaning, when in reality they change depending on the game being played. Wittgenstein's later philosophy transformed linguistics, psychology, and artificial intelligence. His ideas challenged the way we understand knowledge, meaning, and even reality itself. And yet, while Wittgenstein saw philosophy as a tool to clear up confusion, another thinker saw it as a way to uncover the hidden structures that shape human culture. From language and meaning, we now move to Claude Lévi-Strauss and the deep structures of human thought. Claude Lévi-Strauss, Structuralism, and the Deep Structures of Culture. What if beneath the surface of every myth, tradition, and belief, there was a hidden structure, an unseen pattern shaping human thought across all cultures? For Claude Lévi-Strauss, the father of structuralism, human culture was not random. It was built on universal structures, shared ways of thinking that shaped how societies formed, how myths were told, and how humans understood the world. Born in France in the early 20th century, Lévi-Strauss was influenced by linguistics, anthropology, and psychology. Inspired by the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, who revolutionized language studies, Lévi-Strauss asked, if languages have deep structures, rules, and patterns beneath the words we speak, could the same be true for human culture? His answer was yes. Through his research on myths, kinship systems, and rituals across societies, he discovered striking similarities between cultures that had never interacted. Myths from different continents, separated by thousands of years, often followed the same basic structures. Stories of heroes, gods, and creation myths were not just invented at random. They emerged from universal ways the human mind organizes experience. He argued that human thought operates in binary oppositions, fundamental contrasts that shape how we perceive the world. Life versus death, nature versus culture, good versus evil, the sacred versus the profane. These opposites, he believed, were the foundation of how we tell stories, how we form societies, and how we make sense of reality. One of his most famous studies was on mythology. He suggested that myths, no matter where they come from, serve the same function: to resolve contradictions in human thought. Myths take confusing, unexplainable aspects of life, death, chaos, fate, and turn them into structured narratives. For Lévi-Strauss, culture was like a language. Just as all languages follow deep grammatical rules, all societies follow deep mental structures, shaping everything from family relationships to religious beliefs. But his ideas raised new questions. If all human cultures share underlying structures, does this mean free will is an illusion? Are we simply following patterns we don't even realize exist? His ideas influenced anthropology, philosophy, and even literary theory. Structuralism would go on to shape the way scholars analyze film, art, psychology, and media. But not everyone agreed with his view of culture as a fixed system. One philosopher in particular would challenge the idea of deep structures. Instead of looking for universal patterns, he argued that meaning is always shifting, unstable, and never fully graspable. From the rigid structures of human thought, we now turn to Jacques Derrida and the art of deconstruction. Jacques Derrida, Deconstruction and the Limits of Meaning. What if words don't mean what we think they do? What if meaning is never fixed, never stable, but always shifting, always slipping just beyond our grasp? For Jacques Derrida, this wasn't just a linguistic curiosity. It was a radical challenge to philosophy, literature, and even reality itself. Born in French Algeria in the 20th century, Derrida grew up surrounded by colonial tensions, cultural contradictions, and the weight of European intellectual traditions. He saw how language was used to enforce power, how meaning could be manipulated, and how ideas that seemed solid could crumble under closer scrutiny. At the core of his philosophy was deconstruction, a method of analysis that exposed how language, ideas, and systems of thought contain contradictions and hidden assumptions. Derrida's starting point was simple. We think words have clear fixed meanings, but they don't. When we try to define a word, we often use other words. But what do those words mean? They also rely on other words. This creates an endless chain of meaning, with no ultimate foundation. Take a simple concept like justice. Is justice fairness? Is it equality? Is it law? Each definition relies on another concept, which also needs defining. Meaning, Derrida argued, is never absolute. It is always deferred, always shifting, always dependent on context. This idea became known as différance, a play on the French words for difference and deferral. But deconstruction wasn't just about language. Derrida applied it to literature, philosophy, politics, and history. He argued that every system of thought contains hidden contradictions, unstated biases, and layers of complexity that undermine its own claims to truth. For example, Western philosophy often presents reason as superior to emotion, But where is the boundary? Can you reason without feeling? Binary opposites, like male, female, mind-body, civilized, savage, seem clear, but often break down when examined closely. Even identity itself is unstable. What does it mean to be French, American, or human? These categories shift over time, shaped by history, politics, and culture. This made Derrida both revolutionary and controversial. Some saw deconstruction as a powerful tool for uncovering bias and challenging rigid thinking. Others accused him of intellectual destruction, of tearing down meaning without offering anything to replace it. But whether embraced or rejected, his ideas transformed philosophy, literary criticism, and cultural studies. Deconstruction influenced everything from feminism to postcolonialism, from architecture to political theory. And yet, while Derrida deconstructed meaning, another philosopher sought to challenge power itself, not just in words, but in the very institutions that shape society. From the instability of meaning, we now turn to Michel Foucault and the relationship between power, knowledge, and control. Michel Foucault, power, knowledge, and social institutions. What if power isn't just about laws and governments, but about the very way we think? For Michel Foucault, power wasn't something that only kings, presidents, or dictators controlled. It was everywhere. It shaped how we talk, how we act, how we even see ourselves. Power was woven into knowledge itself. Born in France in the mid-20th century, Foucault was one of the most radical thinkers of his time. He didn't just study philosophy, he studied history, medicine, psychiatry, law, prisons, and sexuality. And in every field he found the same pattern: power was shaping knowledge, and knowledge was shaping power. His most famous idea was that power is not just about force, it's about control over ideas. It works through social institutions, schools, hospitals, the media, even science itself. Take mental illness. In the past, people with unusual behavior were sometimes seen as possessed, touched by the divine, or simply different. Then came asylums, psychiatry, and medical classifications. Suddenly, these same people were labeled mad or insane, not by nature, but by a system of knowledge that defined what was normal and what was not. What changed? Not the people themselves, but the way society classified them. Foucault called this the power-knowledge relationship. It wasn't just that people in power controlled knowledge. Knowledge itself was a tool of power. What we call truth is often just the product of who controls the narrative. He explored this idea in Discipline and Punish, his famous history of prisons. He showed how punishment evolved. In medieval times, punishment was brutal, public, and physical. Torture, executions, violence was used to make an example out of criminals. In modern times, punishment became psychological. Instead of public executions, we created prisons. Instead of crushing the body, we disciplined the mind. Foucault argued that modern society didn't get rid of control, it just made it invisible. Instead of chains and whips, we created surveillance, social norms, and self-policing. This led to one of his most famous metaphors, the panopticon. Imagine a circular prison with a tower in the center. Prisoners can't see inside the tower, so they never know when they're being watched. They start to behave as if they're always being observed. Foucault argued that modern society is one giant panopticon. We don't need constant policing. We police ourselves. We follow rules, not because we're forced to, but because we've been conditioned to. We accept norms, not because they are true, but because we've been taught that they are. But this doesn't mean we are powerless. If power shapes knowledge, then resisting power means challenging dominant ideas, questioning the truths we are told. Foucault's work inspired political activists, feminist theorists, and critics of mass surveillance. His ideas shaped discussions on gender, sexuality, colonialism, and institutional control. And yet, while Foucault exposed how systems of power create meaning, another thinker took this even further, arguing that identity itself is constructed, performed, and constantly shifting. From power and institutions, we now turn to Judith Butler and the performance of gender. Judith Butler, Gender Performativity and the Fluidity of Identity. What if gender isn't something you are, but something you do? For Judith Butler, gender was not a fixed identity, not something we are born with or biologically destined for. It was a performance, a repeated set of actions, behaviors, and social expectations that we act out every day. This idea became known as gender performativity, one of the most influential and controversial concepts in modern philosophy. Born in the mid-20th century, Butler was deeply influenced by Michel Foucault, feminist theory, and postmodernism. She saw how society labels people, enforces roles, and teaches us how to be a man or a woman. But what if those labels weren't natural? What if they were just repeated performances, reinforced over time? To understand this, imagine a theater stage. A person steps onto the stage and starts acting like a king. They wear a crown, sit on a throne, speak with authority. The audience treats them as a king. Over time, the role becomes reality. But take away the costume, the throne, the performance, and what is left? Butler argued that gender works the same way. From birth, people are assigned a gender. They are taught how to walk, speak, dress. Girls are encouraged to be feminine, boys to be masculine. Over time, these repeated actions make gender feel natural, even though it is not something we are born with. It is something we learn, something we perform. And what happens when someone refuses to play their assigned role? Society reacts. They are corrected, criticized, or even punished. This shows how gender is enforced, not just by individuals, but by culture, media, and institutions. Butler wasn't saying that gender is fake or meaningless. Instead, she was challenging the idea that it is fixed, stable, or binary. If gender is a performance, then it can be performed in different ways. It can change. It can be resisted. This idea reshaped feminist theory, LGBTQ+ activism, and discussions about identity. It challenged the notion that gender was purely biological, arguing that society plays a much bigger role in shaping how we see ourselves. And yet, while Butler deconstructed identity and performance, another philosopher took an entirely different approach. Instead of questioning gender, he questioned ideology itself, the hidden forces that shape how we think, act, and believe. From gender and performance, we now turn to Slavoj Žižek and the unconscious power of ideology. Slavoj Žižek, the unconscious power of ideology. What if the most dangerous ideas aren't the ones we argue about, but the ones we never even notice? For Slavoj Žižek, ideology isn't just something found in political manifestos or propaganda. It's in everything. It's in the way we speak, the way we shop, the way we entertain ourselves. It shapes our desires, our fears, our sense of reality itself, without us even realizing it. A Slovenian philosopher, Žižek combines Marxism, psychoanalysis, and pop culture to expose the hidden structures of power beneath modern life. He argues that we don't just live under ideology, we live through it. But what is ideology really? In the classic Marxist sense, ideology is a system of beliefs that justifies and maintains power. It tells workers that hard work leads to success, even when the system is rigged against them. It convinces people that wealth is a sign of virtue, even when inequality is obvious. It hides contradictions so that we don't challenge them. But Žižek takes this further. He argues that we don't just obey ideology, we enjoy it. Even when we know a system is unfair, we still participate in it because it gives us comfort, security, or pleasure. Take capitalism. People complain about corporate greed, inequality, environmental destruction, and yet they still consume, still buy, still scroll endlessly through advertisements. Even when we see the flaws, we continue playing the game. Žižek calls this ideological cynicism. Unlike past generations who believed in the systems they lived under, modern people often don't, but they act as if they do anyway. He illustrates this with a famous example from cinema, They Live. In this cult classic film, the main character puts on a special pair of sunglasses, and suddenly he sees the world for what it truly is. Advertisements turn into commands. Obey, consume, submit. The illusion is shattered. Zizek argues that we are all wearing ideological glasses, but unlike in the movie, we don't want to take them off. Even when we glimpse reality, we choose to keep playing along. But is there a way out? Zizek believes that true freedom requires radical self-awareness, not just seeing how ideology works, but understanding how it shapes our desires, our fears, and even our sense of what is possible. He argues that real revolution isn't just about changing governments, it's about changing how we think. His work has influenced political theory, media criticism, and contemporary activism. Whether people agree or disagree, his ideas force us to ask, are we truly free, or are we just playing our roles in a system we don't control? And yet, while Zizek focused on the unconscious forces shaping society, another philosopher looked at a different kind of unconscious structure, the way power operates in culture and history itself. From ideology and desire, we now turn to Edward Said and the invention of the Orient. Edward Said, Orientalism, and the power of cultural narratives. What if the way we see other cultures isn't just biased, but deliberately shaped by power? For Edward Said, the West's understanding of the East wasn't just inaccurate, it was a construction, a myth designed to justify domination. Born in 1935 in British-ruled Palestine, Said saw firsthand how language, history, and media shaped the way the world viewed non-Western societies. He noticed a pattern: the East, the Orient, was always portrayed as exotic, mysterious, irrational, and inferior. Meanwhile, the West, Europe and America, was logical, civilized, and superior. This was not a coincidence. It was a system of power. Said's groundbreaking book, Orientalism, argued that for centuries, Western scholars, politicians, and artists had created a distorted image of the East. These images weren't based on reality, but on the West's need to define itself as superior. Think about the way the Middle East, India, or China are often depicted in literature, films, and news. The wise but primitive mystic, the dangerous, unpredictable terrorist, the exotic, veiled woman in need of saving. Said argued that these aren't just stereotypes, they are tools of control. By portraying the East as backward and irrational, the West justified colonialism, military intervention, and economic exploitation. But Orientalism wasn't just about war or politics, it shaped how people think. Even today, many Westerners learn about non-Western cultures through movies, travel ads, and selective history books, never questioning who created these images. Said's ideas challenged the entire foundation of Western knowledge about the East. He called on scholars, writers, and thinkers to question their sources, to ask who is telling the story and why. His work sparked post-colonial studies, influencing activists, historians, and artists. It forced universities to rethink how they teach history, literature, and politics, and it exposed how knowledge itself can be a form of power. But while Said revealed how history is shaped by narrative, another thinker explored a different kind of historical manipulation, the way totalitarian systems rewrite truth itself. From the hidden biases of culture, we now move to Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil. Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil, and the dangers of thoughtlessness. What if the greatest evils in history weren't committed by monsters, but by ordinary people, people who followed orders without thinking? For Hannah Arendt, evil wasn't always driven by hatred, cruelty, or ideology. Sometimes it was much simpler. It was the result of thoughtlessness, a failure to reflect, to question, to take responsibility. Arendt was a German Jewish philosopher who fled Nazi Germany and later became one of the sharpest political thinkers of the 20th century. She studied power, totalitarianism, and the ways in which governments manipulate reality. But it was during the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi officer, that she uncovered one of her most disturbing insights. Eichmann wasn't a bloodthirsty killer. He wasn't fanatical. He wasn't even particularly hateful. He was shockingly normal. He sat in court, not as a monster, but as a bureaucrat, a man who claimed he was simply following orders. He never questioned the morality of his actions, never considered the suffering he had caused. He just did his job. This, Arendt realized, was the banality of evil. Evil doesn't always come from deep hatred. It can come from ordinary people who refuse to think for themselves, from those who accept authority without question, from those who participate in unjust systems because that's just how things are. Her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, was controversial. Many expected her to portray Eichmann as a monster. Instead, she painted a much more terrifying picture, evil as something dull, bureaucratic, and disturbingly ordinary. But Arendt's insights didn't just apply to Nazi Germany. They apply to any society where people stop questioning, where blind obedience replaces moral responsibility. She warned against totalitarianism, not just as a form of government, but as a way of thinking. Totalitarian regimes don't just control people through force, they shape reality itself. They rewrite history, erase dissent, and create a world where questioning the system feels impossible. Her work remains crucial today, influencing debates on authoritarianism, free speech, and the ethics of responsibility. Because even in democratic societies, when people stop thinking critically, when they accept injustice as normal, when they follow orders without question, that is when the banality of evil thrives. And yet, while Arendt exposed the dangers of mindless obedience, another philosopher examined a different kind of control, not through politics, but through mass culture. From political manipulation, we now turn to Theodor Adorno and the culture industry. Theodor Adorno, The Culture Industry and Manufactured Consciousness. What if entertainment wasn't just entertainment, but a tool of control? For Theodor Adorno, popular culture wasn't just about movies, music, or television. It was a machine, designed not to enlighten, but to pacify. A German philosopher and sociologist, Adorno was part of the Frankfurt School, a group of thinkers who analyzed power, ideology, and mass culture in the 20th century. They saw something disturbing happening in modern society. While dictatorships controlled people through force, capitalist democracies controlled them in a different way, through entertainment. Adorno called this the culture industry. At first glance, popular culture seems harmless. People watch movies, listen to music, and follow celebrities for fun. But Adorno argued that this wasn't just entertainment, it was conditioning. Movies teach us how to think about love, success, and happiness. Music creates predictable emotions, reinforcing the same ideas over and over. Television shows turn rebellion into a joke, making it easy to dismiss. All of this, he argued, created a passive population, one that consumes, obeys, and never questions the system. The problem wasn't just that entertainment was repetitive or shallow. It was that it disguised itself as freedom. People believed they were choosing what to watch, what to listen to, what to buy. But in reality, their tastes, desires, and values were being shaped for them. He compared the culture industry to a factory, mass-producing entertainment in predictable, standardized ways. Hollywood films follow the same formulas. Pop songs repeat the same chord progressions. Television shows recycle the same narratives. Everything feels different, but it's all designed to distract, to numb, to keep people consuming without thinking critically. And the most dangerous part, people enjoy it. Unlike authoritarian regimes which use violence to suppress dissent, the culture industry makes people complicit in their own oppression. It feeds them comfort, escapism, and endless distractions, so that they never stop to ask deeper questions. But Adorno's critique wasn't just about art. It was about power. He argued that capitalism doesn't just control people through work, it controls them through leisure. And yet, while Adorno saw mass media as a tool of oppression, another thinker saw it as something else, not just a way to entertain or manipulate, but a battleground. From the passive consumption of culture, we now turn to Jürgen Habermas and the fight for the public sphere. Jürgen Habermas, the public sphere and the fight for rational discourse. What if democracy wasn't just about voting, but about conversation? For Jürgen Habermas, the foundation of a free society wasn't just laws, elections, or institutions. It was the ability of citizens to come together, debate, and exchange ideas openly. Without this, democracy was just an illusion. A German philosopher and sociologist, Habermas saw how modern societies were losing something crucial, the ability to engage in rational public debate. Instead of true discussion, people were being bombarded with corporate media, political propaganda, and shallow entertainment. To understand this, he introduced the concept of the public sphere. In the past, public spaces like coffee houses, salons, and town halls were where people gathered to discuss politics, philosophy, and social issues. These spaces allowed for critical debate, a place where ideas could be challenged, where citizens could influence society. But in modern times, this public sphere had been corrupted. Instead of open discussion, mass media, controlled by powerful corporations and political elites, began shaping the conversation. News became sensationalized. Debate turned into sound bites. Political discourse became a product, sold like entertainment, and as a result, the public lost its voice. Instead of questioning authority, people absorbed prepackaged opinions. Instead of thinking critically, they became passive consumers of information. But Habermas believed that democracy could only survive if the public sphere was restored. He argued for independent media that wasn't controlled by corporate interests, genuine public forums where citizens could engage in meaningful debate, a culture of rational discourse where persuasion came from logic, not manipulation. His ideas shaped modern discussions on free speech, journalism, and digital democracy. Today, debates about social media, fake news, and political polarization all echo Habermas's warnings about the public sphere's decline. But while Habermas believed in the power of rational debate, another philosopher saw something different. She argued that behind every debate, every idea, every cultural force, there was a hidden struggle for power. From the ideal of open discourse, we now turn to Simone de Beauvoir and the philosophy of gender and oppression. Simone de Beauvoir, Feminist Philosophy and the Second Sex. What if you weren't born a woman, but became one? For Simone de Beauvoir, gender wasn't just a biological fact, it was a social and philosophical construction. Women were not inherently different from men, they were made different by society. A French existentialist and philosopher, de Beauvoir was deeply influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre and the existentialist idea that existence precedes essence. Just as Sartre argued that humans define themselves through their choices, de Beauvoir argued that women were not born with a fixed identity, society imposed it on them. Her most famous work, The Second Sex, was a groundbreaking exploration of how women had been historically oppressed, not through force alone, but through ideas, customs, and expectations. At the heart of her argument was this: men were seen as the default, the universal, the subject, the one who acts. Women, by contrast, were seen as the other, defined in relation to men, expected to be passive, secondary, dependent. This wasn't just about physical oppression. It was psychological, cultural, existential. From birth, women were taught to be pleasing, to be modest, to be nurturing, while men were taught to be assertive, ambitious, and free. And the most dangerous part? Many women accepted this role without question. De Beauvoir called this immanence, the state of being trapped within a role that society has assigned to you. In contrast, she argued for transcendence, the ability to define oneself beyond societal expectations. She saw marriage, motherhood, and traditional femininity not as natural destinies, but as choices that had been framed as inevitable. True liberation, she argued, meant giving women the same existential freedom as men, the right to create their own identity. Her ideas shaped feminism, gender theory, and political activism. Decades later, her work would influence thinkers like Judith Butler, who challenged not just gender roles, but the very concept of gender itself. And yet, while de Beauvoir exposed the structures of oppression in gender, another thinker focused on how oppression functioned within entire economic and political systems. From gender and identity, we now turn to John Rawls and the philosophy of justice. John Rawls, The Veil of Ignorance and the Philosophy of Justice. What if you had to design society from scratch, but you didn't know who you'd be in it? For John Rawls, this was the ultimate test of fairness. Would you still support a system if you didn't know whether you'd be rich or poor, privileged or oppressed? Born in 1921, Rawls became one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century. At a time when debates about justice were often reduced to capitalism versus socialism, he introduced a completely different approach, one based on fairness, reason, and moral intuition. His most famous concept, the veil of ignorance, was a thought experiment designed to answer one question: what would a truly just society look like? Imagine you are about to be born, but before you enter the world, you must design the rules of society. Here's the catch. You don't know who you will be. You don't know your gender, race, wealth, intelligence, or social status. You could be a billionaire, or you could be born into extreme poverty. With this uncertainty, how would you structure society? Rawls argued that under this veil of ignorance, rational people would choose a fair system, one that protects the most vulnerable, because no one would want to be born into disadvantage. From this, he developed two principles of justice. First, equal basic liberties. Everyone should have fundamental freedoms, like freedom of speech, religion, and political participation. And second, the difference principle. Inequality is only justifiable if it benefits the least advantaged members of society. This didn't mean everyone should be completely equal. Rawls wasn't against wealth, success, or ambition, but he argued that any advantages in society should also help those at the bottom. For example, higher salaries for doctors can be justified because they encourage people to train in medicine, which benefits everyone. Rawls's theory was revolutionary because it provided a rational, ethical framework for justice, one that didn't rely on religious doctrine, national identity, or economic ideology. His ideas shaped modern liberal democracies, human rights discussions, and debates on economic inequality. Even today, his thought experiment is used in discussions about taxation, healthcare, education, and wealth distribution. And yet, while Rawls envisioned a balanced, just society, another thinker argued for the opposite: absolute individual freedom, even at the cost of social inequality. From fairness and justice, we now turn to Robert Nozick and the philosophy of libertarianism. Robert Nozick, The Philosophy of Libertarianism and the Minimal State. What if taxation was a form of theft? For Robert Nozick, the idea that governments could take wealth from one person and give it to another, no matter how noble the cause, was a violation of individual freedom. Justice, he argued, wasn't about redistributing wealth or ensuring equality. It was about protecting people from force and interference. A response to John Rawls's vision of fairness, Nozick's anarchy, state, and utopia made the case for libertarianism, a political philosophy centered on individual rights, voluntary exchange, and minimal government. Rawls believed that a just society required policies that helped the least advantaged. Nozick completely rejected this. He argued that people have the right to their earnings, their property, and their choices, even if this results in inequality. No state, no government, no social contract should have the power to interfere. To illustrate this, Nozick used a famous thought experiment, the Wilt Chamberlain example. Imagine a society where wealth is perfectly distributed. Everyone has exactly the same amount of money. Now, imagine that Wilt Chamberlain, a famous basketball player, agrees to play only if fans voluntarily pay to see him. 1 million people decide to give him a small portion of their wealth because they enjoy watching him play. By the end of the season, Wilt Chamberlain has far more money than anyone else. This is now an unequal society. But is this inequality unfair? Nozick argued that it isn't. The fans made their payments voluntarily. Chamberlain didn't steal or force anyone to give him money. He simply benefited from the choices of free individuals. This, Nozick said, is why Rawls's idea of fairness is flawed. You can't force society into equality without violating personal freedom. The only just system is one where people are left alone to make their own decisions. Nozick also believed that the government should be as small as possible, existing only to protect individuals from force, theft, and fraud, uphold contracts, and ensure national defense. Everything else, welfare, public health care, progressive taxation, was unjust because it involved taking from some to give to others. Nozick's ideas became hugely influential in free market economics, conservative politics, and debates on government intervention. His work influenced Reaganomics, neoliberal policies, and modern libertarian movements. But while Nozick focused on personal liberty, another philosopher looked at ethics on a completely different scale, not just in economics or government, but in how we treat the most vulnerable beings on the planet. From the philosophy of personal freedom, we now turn to Peter Singer and the ethics of altruism. Peter Singer, Effective Altruism and the Ethics of Giving. What if failing to help a stranger in need was as immoral as letting them drown? For Peter Singer, morality wasn't just about avoiding harm, it was about actively reducing suffering. If we can help others without sacrificing anything of real significance, then we are morally obligated to do so. Born in Australia in 1946, Singer became one of the most influential ethical philosophers of modern times. His work focuses on applied ethics, not abstract theories, but real-world moral questions. And one of his biggest challenges to conventional thinking was the duty to help others. Singer asks us to imagine this scenario. You're walking past a shallow pond and notice a child drowning. No one else is around. You could easily wade in and save them, but it would mean getting your clothes muddy and ruining your shoes. Would you hesitate? Most people say no. The inconvenience of ruining your clothes is nothing compared to saving a life. But then Singer takes it further. Every day, children die from poverty, disease, and lack of clean water. You could save a life simply by donating money to an effective charity. The cost of your new shoes or an expensive meal could mean medical treatment, food, or clean drinking water for someone in need. If you wouldn't let a child drown in front of you, why is it different when the suffering is far away? This question became the foundation of effective altruism, a movement inspired by Singer's philosophy. It argues that we should donate strategically, choosing charities with proven impact rather than giving emotionally. Causes should be prioritized based on evidence, focusing on those that save the most lives per dollar spent. It also challenges the morality of luxury spending when that money could prevent suffering. Singer's ideas challenge consumerism, economic inequality, and our sense of moral responsibility. He argues that failing to act is not just neutral, it is actively allowing suffering to continue. But his philosophy extends beyond human suffering. Singer is also one of the most influential figures in animal ethics. His book, Animal Liberation, argued that animals deserve moral consideration, not just because they are intelligent, but because they can suffer. His work has influenced veganism, philanthropy, and global humanitarian efforts. But it also raises tough questions. How much are we morally obligated to give? If we focus on the most effective causes, do we ignore smaller ones? And while Singer called for ethical responsibility toward others, another philosopher turned to the very nature of consciousness itself, arguing that even our sense of free will might be an illusion. From the ethics of giving, we now turn to Daniel Dennett and the mystery of the mind. Daniel Dennett, Consciousness and the Illusion of Free Will. What if your decisions weren't really yours? For Daniel Dennett, the comforting belief that we freely choose our actions might be nothing more than an illusion. We feel like conscious agents making deliberate choices, but beneath the surface, our brains may simply be following patterns shaped by biology, experience, and hidden processes we don't control. Dennett is one of the most influential thinkers in philosophy of mind and cognitive science. Unlike traditional philosophers who treated consciousness as a mystery or a metaphysical problem, Dennett approached it like a scientist, breaking it down, analyzing it, and challenging its very existence. Many people imagine consciousness as a kind of internal theater, a place in the brain where you sit, watching thoughts, memories, and sensations unfold like a movie. This view, rooted in René Descartes' dualism, suggests that there's a central self experiencing reality. Dennett completely rejected this. He argued that there is no single place in the brain where consciousness happens. Instead, what we call consciousness is the result of countless unconscious processes working together, interacting and competing for attention, like a massive orchestra with no conductor. This became known as the multiple drafts model. There is no fixed you watching a mental movie. Your thoughts, memories, and choices are constantly being rewritten by different brain processes. What you experience as you is just the latest draft, pieced together after the fact. But if consciousness isn't what it seems, what about free will? Dennett agreed with thinkers like Sam Harris and neuroscience researchers who argued that our choices might not be as free as we think. Studies in neuroscience have shown that decisions can often be predicted before we are consciously aware of making them. Brain scans detect activity milliseconds before a person reports having made a choice, suggesting that our brains decide before we even realize it. This led many to believe that free will doesn't exist at all. But Dennett took a different approach. He argued that even if free will isn't some magical ability to break the laws of physics, it still matters. What we call free will might just be a sophisticated system of decision-making built into our biology. We process information, weigh options, and predict outcomes. Our brains consider past experiences and future consequences. Even if this system follows physical laws, it still creates meaningful choices. To Dennett, what matters isn't whether free will is an illusion, it's whether our choices are shaped by reason, experience, and understanding. His work has shaped modern debates on consciousness, artificial intelligence, and the philosophy of mind, and his challenge remains. If we are just biological machines, driven by processes beyond our control, what does that mean for morality, responsibility, and meaning itself? But while Dennett questioned the illusion of free will, another philosopher questioned an even deeper illusion, the idea that reality itself could be fully grasped. From the mystery of consciousness, we now turn to Bertrand Russell and the nature of truth itself. Bertrand Russell, The Nature of Truth and the Limits of Knowledge. What if everything you believed to be true was simply a convenient assumption? For Bertrand Russell, truth was not about certainty, it was about logic, skepticism, and a willingness to question even the most basic beliefs. If we accept things without proof, we risk building an entire worldview on shaky foundations. Russell, one of the greatest philosophers and logicians of the 20th century, sought to strip away illusion, bias, and vague thinking to uncover the structure of truth itself. But could truth ever be fully grasped? Russell was obsessed with precision and thought. He wanted to make philosophy as rigorous as mathematics, where every statement could be broken down into its purest logical form. This led him to co-author Principia Mathematica, an attempt to ground all of mathematics in formal logic. But the project ran into an unsettling problem. No system of logic could fully prove itself. There would always be limits, always unprovable assumptions lurking beneath. The realization that even mathematics, seemingly the most certain of all fields, had cracks in its foundation forced Russell to rethink truth itself. Russell argued that many beliefs persist, not because they are true, but because they are comfortable. He used a famous analogy to illustrate this. Imagine a cosmic teapot floating in space, too small to be detected by telescopes. If someone claims it exists, the burden of proof isn't on skeptics to disprove it. It's on the person making the claim. This became known as Russell's teapot, a way of demonstrating that just because something can't be disproven doesn't mean we should believe it. He applied this logic to religion, politics, and philosophy, arguing that truth should be built on reason, not tradition or wishful thinking. Despite his commitment to logic, Russell was not an absolutist. He acknowledged that truth is often complex, uncertain, and evolving. Even in science, what we consider true today may be revised tomorrow. This led him to embrace a kind of rational humility, the idea that we must constantly refine our beliefs, never clinging to dogma, never assuming we have reached the final answer. Russell's ideas influenced modern skepticism, analytic philosophy, and debates on science and religion. His commitment to truth wasn't just an intellectual pursuit, it was a moral stance. He believed that falsehoods, when left unchallenged, lead to ignorance, suffering, and even oppression. And yet, while Bertrand Russell sought objective truth through logic, another philosopher took truth in an entirely different direction, arguing that reality itself might not exist as we think it does. From the search for certainty, we now turn to George Berkeley and the radical claim that matter itself is an illusion. George Berkeley, Idealism, and the non-existence of matter. What if everything you see, touch, and experience isn't actually real? For George Berkeley, this wasn't a thought experiment, it was reality itself. He argued that matter does not exist. The physical world, the objects around you, even your own body, they are all just perceptions in the mind. Born in 1685, Berkeley was an Irish philosopher who took empiricism, the idea that all knowledge comes from experience, to its most extreme conclusion. Unlike John Locke, who believed in a world of material objects that we perceive, Berkeley claimed that perception is all there is. This view became known as idealism, the belief that reality is fundamentally mental, not physical. Berkeley's most famous idea can be summed up in one phrase: esse est percepi, to be is to be perceived. Think about it. When you see a tree, what are you actually experiencing? You don't experience the tree itself. You experience color, texture, smell, a collection of sensations. But where do these sensations exist? Only in your mind. Now imagine you leave the room. You can no longer see the tree. Does it still exist? Berkeley would say no, because its existence was never separate from your perception of it. For him, it made no sense to talk about an external world beyond experience. Everything that exists does so only because it is being perceived. But this raises a huge problem. If reality is just perception, then what happens when no one is looking? Does the world blink out of existence? Berkeley's solution was simple. The world continues to exist because it is always being perceived by God. God, he argued, is the infinite mind that perceives all things at all times. Even if no human is looking at the tree, God is, and that's why it remains. To Berkeley, this was not just philosophy. It was proof of God's existence. The stability of reality wasn't due to physical matter, but to divine perception. At first, Berkeley's ideas sound absurd. How can the world be purely mental? But in many ways, his philosophy foreshadowed modern science. Quantum mechanics suggests that particles exist in an indeterminate state until they are observed. Neuroscience tells us that our experience of reality is constructed in the brain. Virtual reality demonstrates that the mind can fully accept artificial environments as real. His work influenced modern philosophy, psychology, and debates on consciousness. Whether we accept his theory or not, his challenge remains: can we ever prove that a world exists beyond our perception? And yet, while Berkeley reduced reality to pure perception, another thinker went in the opposite direction, seeking absolute certainty in scientific reasoning. From the illusion of matter, we now turn to Francis Bacon and the birth of the scientific method. Francis Bacon, the birth of the scientific method and the power of observation. What if everything we think we know is built on flawed assumptions? For Francis Bacon, knowledge wasn't about trusting ancient wisdom, religious doctrine, or philosophical speculation. It was about observation, experiment, and careful reasoning. If humans wanted to truly understand the world, they had to stop relying on old ideas and start testing reality for themselves. Born in 1561, Bacon is often called the father of the scientific method. At a time when knowledge was still dominated by Aristotle's logic and medieval religious thinking, he argued that progress required a new way of thinking, one based on empirical evidence, not authority. Before Bacon, knowledge was often built on the wisdom of the past. If an idea had been written by Aristotle or the Church, it was assumed to be true. The world was explained through logic, deduction, and inherited beliefs, rather than through direct observation. But Bacon saw the flaws in this approach. He believed that human thinking was filled with biases, assumptions, and illusions, barriers to true understanding that he called idols of the mind. These included idols of the tribe, the natural biases all humans have because of our limited perspective; idols of the cave, the personal biases we develop based on our own experiences and culture; idols of the marketplace, the confusion caused by language and the way words distort meaning; idols of the theater, the blind acceptance of established traditions, dogmas, and authority. To escape these errors, Bacon proposed a new system of inquiry, the scientific method. Bacon argued that knowledge should come from observation and experiment, not from ancient texts or abstract reasoning. His method followed a simple but revolutionary idea. First, observe the world carefully. Second, form a hypothesis, a possible explanation. Third, test that hypothesis through experiments. Fourth, analyze the results and refine your understanding. And fifth, repeat the process until you reach reliable conclusions. This seems obvious today, but at the time it was a radical break from tradition. Instead of assuming the world worked a certain way, Bacon insisted that truth had to be discovered through evidence. Bacon's scientific method laid the foundation for modern science. His ideas paved the way for thinkers like Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, and Albert Einstein. They influenced medicine, technology, and engineering, driving the scientific revolution and shaping the modern world. His vision of knowledge wasn't just about curiosity, it was about power. Bacon famously said, "Knowledge is power," meaning that science could be used not just to understand nature, but to control it, improve it, and reshape the human experience. But while Bacon believed in the power of reason and observation, another thinker took a different approach, arguing that skepticism, doubt, and self-reflection were just as important in the search for truth. From the certainty of the scientific method, we now turn to Michel de Montaigne and the art of living through skepticism. Michel de Montaigne, the art of living through skepticism. What if the wisest thing you could say was, "I don't know"? For Michel de Montaigne, certainty was an illusion. The more he explored philosophy, religion, and human nature, the more he realized how little we truly understand. Instead of searching for absolute answers, he embraced doubt, questioning, and the unpredictability of life. Born in 1533, Montaigne lived through a time of war, religious conflict, and political instability. While others fought to impose their truths, he withdrew to his private library and turned inward, writing the first great work of personal philosophy. His masterpiece, Essays, was unlike anything before it. Instead of making grand claims, Montaigne simply observed life as it was, its contradictions, absurdities, and uncertainties. Montaigne was deeply influenced by ancient skeptics who argued that human knowledge is always limited, shaped by personal bias, and full of contradictions. He believed that we rarely know as much as we think we do. Truth is complex, and absolute certainty is dangerous. The more we accept our ignorance, the wiser we become. This skepticism wasn't about cynicism or despair, it was about freedom. By letting go of the need for certainty, Montaigne argued, we can live with more humility, tolerance, and openness to new ideas. Montaigne's philosophy wasn't just about knowledge, it was about how to live. Instead of chasing rigid ideologies, he argued that life is best lived through curiosity, flexibility, and humor. He explored questions like, why do we fear death? He believed that accepting mortality makes life richer. Are humans rational? No. Our beliefs are shaped by culture, emotion, and habit more than logic. How should we treat others? With kindness and understanding, since we are all deeply flawed. His essays were deeply personal, filled with self-reflection, contradictions, and honesty about his own doubts. In a world obsessed with certainty, Montaigne dared to say, I don't have all the answers. His work shaped modern philosophy, literature, and psychology. He influenced thinkers like Descartes, Nietzsche, and Emerson. His personal introspective style even shaped modern essays and memoirs. But while Montaigne embraced skepticism and personal freedom, another philosopher took a much darker view, arguing that human nature was driven not by reason but by blind, irrational forces. From skepticism and self-reflection, we now turn to Arthur Schopenhauer and the will to live. Arthur Schopenhauer, the will to live, and the tragic nature of existence. What if life wasn't driven by reason, morality, or even happiness, but by a blind, relentless force that we can never truly control? For Arthur Schopenhauer, human existence was not guided by logic or free will, but by an unconscious, irrational drive, a force he called the will. We don't live because we choose to. We live because we are compelled to. Every desire, every action, every suffering, all of it is a manifestation of this relentless will. Born in 1788, Schopenhauer was a German philosopher who took a radically pessimistic view of human nature. Unlike earlier thinkers who saw reason or divine purpose as central to life, he argued that life had no higher meaning. Instead, we are all trapped in a cycle of endless striving, suffering, and fleeting satisfaction. Schopenhauer believed that at the core of every living thing, humans, animals, even plants, was an unconscious drive to survive and reproduce. This will to live was not rational, not thoughtful, not ethical. It was simply a force pushing us forward, making us chase desires that can never fully satisfy us. He described life as a cruel game. We are always chasing something: pleasure, success, love, power. But once we get it, the satisfaction fades, and a new desire takes its place. If we don't get what we want, we suffer. If we do, we soon grow restless and want more. No matter what we do, the will keeps driving us forward, ensuring that we never find lasting happiness. For Schopenhauer, suffering wasn't an exception in life. It was the rule. He argued that if you look at nature, you don't see a harmonious, benevolent world. You see endless struggle, competition, and pain. Animals live in constant fear of predators. Humans experience heartbreak, anxiety, aging, and death. Even the rare moments of happiness we experience are temporary, quick flashes of relief before we are consumed by new desires. This led him to a conclusion radically different from most Western philosophers. Life is not something to celebrate, but something to endure. So how do we escape the tyranny of the will? Schopenhauer offered two main solutions. 1. Aesthetic experience. Art, music, and beauty allow us to momentarily rise above our desires. Great music, for example, is pure will expressed in sound, and listening to it lets us lose ourselves, if only briefly. 2. Asceticism. Inspired by Eastern philosophy, Schopenhauer believed that true peace comes from renouncing desire altogether. By rejecting materialism, ego, and attachment, we can free ourselves from the will's endless demands. Schopenhauer's bleak outlook influenced existentialism, psychology, and literature. He shaped the thinking of Nietzsche, Freud, Wagner, and even Einstein. His philosophy foreshadowed Buddhist and Stoic ideas of detachment and suffering. But while Schopenhauer saw suffering as inescapable, another thinker embraced life not as a burden, but as an act of rebellion. From the tragedy of existence, we now turn to Henry David Thoreau and the pursuit of freedom in nature. Henry David Thoreau, Transcendentalism and the Pursuit of Freedom in Nature. What if everything modern society told you about success, progress, and happiness was wrong? For Henry David Thoreau, life was not meant to be spent chasing wealth, status, or comfort. True freedom, he believed, could only be found in simplicity, self-reliance, and deep connection with nature. Born in 1817, Thoreau was part of the Transcendentalist movement, a philosophy that rejected materialism and argued that truth comes not from society, but from direct personal experience. Instead of looking to tradition, religion, or government for guidance, Transcendentalists trusted intuition, nature, and the power of the individual. Thoreau believed that most people lived as slaves to a broken system, trapped in endless labor, debt, and obligation. So instead of following the expected path, he left society behind. In 1845, he moved to a small cabin by Walden Pond in Massachusetts, where he spent 2 years living in near-total solitude. He built his own shelter, grew his own food, and embraced a life of radical independence. His book Walden became a manifesto for simple living, a rejection of consumerism, conformity, and the pressures of industrial society. His philosophy was clear. People work their entire lives for luxuries they don't need. True wealth isn't money. It's time, freedom, and a clear mind. Nature is the best teacher, offering wisdom beyond what any book or school can provide. To Thoreau, modern life was a trap. People wasted their existence chasing artificial success when real happiness could be found in the quiet of the woods, in the songs of birds, in the stillness of a pond at sunrise. But Thoreau wasn't just a hermit. He was a rebel. He believed that governments often acted unjustly and that individuals had a duty to resist. In 1846, he was arrested for refusing to pay taxes that funded slavery and the Mexican-American War. This led him to write Civil Disobedience, an essay arguing that people should follow their conscience, not blindly obey laws. If a government is corrupt, moral people must resist it. Change comes not from obedience, but from nonviolent defiance. His ideas directly influenced Mahatma Gandhi's fight against British rule and Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights movement. His belief in nonviolent resistance and personal moral responsibility became one of the most powerful political philosophies of modern history. His ideas shaped environmentalism, minimalism, and modern activism. Whether in the Back to the Land movement, anti-war protests, or sustainable living, his call for simplicity and resistance still echoes today. But while Thoreau sought freedom and solitude, another philosopher took a radically different approach, arguing that true meaning wasn't found in nature or rebellion, but in the choices we make and the beliefs we hold. From the self-reliance of Walden, we now turn to William James and the philosophy of pragmatism. William James, the philosophy of pragmatism and the will to believe. What if truth wasn't something we discover, but something we create? For William James, truth wasn't an absolute fixed thing waiting to be found. It was a process, a living, evolving idea that depends on its usefulness in the real world. Unlike traditional philosophers who searched for universal, eternal truths, James argued that truth is whatever works. Truth is what works. This radical idea became known as pragmatism, a uniquely American philosophy that rejected abstract theorizing and focused on action, experience, and results. James believed that we don't think in order to describe reality, we think in order to survive. And because life is always changing, our ideas must be flexible, adapting to new experiences. He argued that truth is not just something we discover, it's something we test through experience. Ideas should be judged by their practical effects. If a belief helps us navigate life successfully, it is true in a meaningful sense. Theories are tools, not ultimate answers. They should be kept only if they are useful and discarded if they are not. For example, take scientific theories. Newton's laws of motion were once seen as absolute truths, but later Einstein's relativity showed they were only approximations. Science, James argued, works this way, constantly evolving, always testing what is useful. But pragmatism wasn't just about science. It applied to morality, religion, and even personal decisions. James took this idea even further in his famous essay, The Will to Believe. He argued that sometimes we have to commit to a belief before we have absolute proof. Think about love. If you refuse to believe in love until it's scientifically proven, you may never experience it. But if you take a leap of faith and believe in it, you might create the very conditions for it to become real. James used this argument to defend religious faith. He believed that while religion could never be proven in the traditional sense, it could still be valuable if it helped people live better lives. This was a stark contrast to Bertrand Russell's skepticism and Nietzsche's atheism. James wasn't trying to prove or disprove God. He simply argued that beliefs should be judged by their impact, not by whether they meet strict logical standards. His ideas shaped psychology, education, and even self-help philosophy. His belief in the power of choice influenced thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and existentialism, while his pragmatism became a guiding principle in American philosophy and politics. But while James embraced a flexible, evolving view of truth, another philosopher took a different approach, arguing that behind every belief, every political system, and every law, there was something deeper: power. From pragmatism and belief, we now turn to Niccolò Machiavelli and the ruthless logic of power. Niccolò Machiavelli, the ruthless logic of power and political realism. What if being a good person makes you a bad leader? For Niccolò Machiavelli, the world of politics wasn't about morality, virtue, or fairness. It was about power. Leaders who tried to be kind, honest, and noble, they were the first to fall. Born in Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli witnessed constant political instability, betrayals, and wars for control. He saw that rulers who played by the rules often lost, while those willing to be ruthless survived. From these observations, he wrote The Prince, a book that shocked the world by stripping politics down to its brutal core. Before Machiavelli, most political philosophy was about how leaders should be virtuous, just, and wise. But Machiavelli rejected this idealism. He argued that people are selfish, unpredictable, and easily manipulated. A ruler who is too kind or too trusting will be destroyed. To hold power, a leader must be willing to deceive, betray, and even use cruelty when necessary. This wasn't just an opinion. It was a survival guide for rulers. One of Machiavelli's most famous questions was, should a leader be loved or feared? His answer? Both are ideal, but if you must choose, it is better to be feared. Why? Because love is fragile. People's affections change, and loyalty fades when times get tough. But fear is reliable. Fear keeps people obedient. This doesn't mean a ruler should be cruel for no reason. Machiavelli advised against unnecessary violence. Instead, a leader should use force carefully, strategically, and decisively. Machiavelli argued that leaders should focus on results, not morality. If lying, deception, or violence was necessary to maintain stability, then so be it. A ruler's first duty is to secure power, because without power, nothing else matters. If a ruler needs to break a promise to protect the state, they should. If peace can only be secured through war, then war is justified. If appearing virtuous gains the trust of the people, then a ruler should pretend to be virtuous, but never be trapped by it. This philosophy, often summed up as the ends justify the means, made The Prince one of the most controversial books in history. His ideas shaped modern politics, diplomacy, and even corporate strategy. His work influenced figures from Napoleon to modern CEOs, anyone who operates in a world where power is competitive, brutal, and unstable. But while Machiavelli focused on the raw pursuit of power, another philosopher asked a deeper question: what if the best way to secure power wasn't through fear, but through social contracts and mutual agreements? From ruthless political realism, we now turn to Thomas Hobbes and the social contract that keeps society from chaos. Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan and the Social Contract. What if human nature was violent, selfish, and destined for chaos? For Thomas Hobbes, society wasn't built on trust, morality, or cooperation. It was built to keep human beings from destroying one another. Left to our own devices, he believed, we would live in a state of constant fear, violence, and anarchy. Born in 1588, Hobbes lived through civil war and political instability in England, witnessing firsthand how easily society could collapse. His experiences led him to write Leviathan, one of the most influential political works in history, where he argued that without a strong absolute government, life would be unbearable. Hobbes imagined a world without laws, rulers, or organized society. He called this the state of nature, and he described it as nothing short of a nightmare. Without government, people would act purely in their own self-interest. There would be no justice, only power. Everyone would fear for their lives, as anyone could kill or steal at any time. In perhaps his most famous passage, Hobbes described life in this state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Unlike philosophers like Jean-Jacques, who saw humans as capable of reason and cooperation, Hobbes believed we were driven primarily by fear and self-preservation. If the state of nature is so terrible, how do we escape it? Hobbes proposed that people willingly give up certain freedoms in exchange for protection and stability. This agreement is what he called the social contract. People surrender their absolute freedom to a ruler or government. In return, the government provides law, order, and security. Without this agreement, society would collapse into chaos. Hobbes argued that this government, the Leviathan, should be absolute. A strong, centralized power was the only way to maintain stability. Whether this ruler was a king or a governing body didn't matter. What mattered was that people obeyed, because the alternative was anarchy. Hobbes's vision of government was not about democracy, human rights, or freedom. It was about control. He believed that people should not resist or question authority, even if their rulers were harsh. This made his ideas deeply controversial. Critics argued that he was advocating for tyranny, a world where rulers had unchecked power and citizens had no right to challenge them. But his ideas remain highly influential in modern debates about government, security, and individual rights. His work inspired later political philosophers like Jean-Jacques and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who accepted the idea of the social contract but argued for a more democratic, participatory form of government. And yet, while Hobbes saw government as a necessary force to control chaos, another thinker took a radically different view, arguing that true freedom required not submission, but collective will. From Hobbes' Leviathan, we now turn to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the idea of the general will. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the social contract, and the general will. What if true freedom required giving up personal desires? For Jean-Jacques Rousseau, real liberty wasn't about doing whatever you wanted. It was about living under rules that you and everyone else agreed upon as a collective. This idea of shared governance, which he called the general will, became one of the most influential concepts in political philosophy. Born in 1712, Rousseau grew up watching monarchies and aristocracies rule over people who had no say in how they were governed. Unlike Thomas Hobbes, who believed strong rulers were necessary to prevent chaos, Rousseau believed the only legitimate government was one based on the collective will of the people. His most famous work, The Social Contract, put forward a radical idea. Society should be governed by the people, for the people, with no kings, no divine right, only the general will. Rousseau agreed with Hobbes that society needed a social contract, an agreement between individuals to create a stable society. But where Hobbes saw this contract as a way to submit to authority, Rousseau saw it as a way to ensure true freedom. His argument was simple. Laws are only legitimate if they come from the people themselves. A just government must represent the general will, the shared interests of all citizens. If people obey laws they helped create, they are not being ruled, they are ruling themselves. This was a completely new way of thinking about government. Instead of monarchy or tyranny, Rousseau imagined a system where people voluntarily followed laws because those laws reflected their collective will. Rousseau's most controversial idea was the general will. the idea that society should be governed not by individual self-interest, but by the common good. It is not the same as majority rule. The general will is what is best for society as a whole, not just what most people want at a given moment. It is not personal freedom, but collective freedom. True liberty comes not from following personal desires, but from aligning with the greater good. Sometimes, individuals must be forced to be free. If someone refuses to obey the laws that reflect the general will, they are not just disobeying the government, they are acting against their own best interest. This last idea, that people could be forced to be free, became one of Rousseau's most controversial claims. Critics feared it could justify oppression in the name of the greater good. Some even saw his ideas as influencing later totalitarian regimes, where governments claimed to act on behalf of the people while silencing dissent. Despite the controversy, Rousseau's ideas helped inspire revolutions, democracy, and modern political thought. His writings influenced the French Revolution, where radical leaders cited his work while overthrowing the monarchy. Modern democracy, shaping ideas about popular sovereignty and direct participation in government. The philosophy of individual rights and civic duty, forming the backbone of many constitutions. But while Rousseau focused on the will of the people, another thinker took a completely different approach, arguing that governments should not be based on the shifting will of the masses, but on cold, hard logic. From the passion of the general will, we now turn to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and the best of all possible worlds. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, Monadology and the best of all possible worlds. What if everything, every joy, every tragedy, every moment of suffering was already part of the best possible world? For Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, this wasn't just an optimistic belief, it was a logical necessity. He argued that the universe we live in must be the best version that could ever exist. No matter how much suffering we see, no matter how much injustice we endure, things could not have been arranged in a better way. Born in 1646, Leibniz was a German philosopher, mathematician, and logician whose work influenced everything from calculus to metaphysics. While most philosophers asked how we can understand reality, Leibniz asked why reality exists at all. And his answer? Because this is the best possible world. One of the greatest philosophical problems is the problem of evil. How can a perfect, all-powerful God allow suffering? Leibniz answered this by claiming that God, being perfect, created the best world that was logically possible. This doesn't mean the world is free of suffering, but that any other world would be worse. What appears as evil or imperfection might be necessary for the greater good. For example, he argued that suffering might exist to create virtues like courage and resilience. Weakness and limitation might be necessary to make free will meaningful. This idea, called the best of all possible worlds, was deeply controversial. Many saw it as an excuse for suffering, a justification for injustice. It was famously mocked by Voltaire in Candide, where a character insists, despite endless disasters, that all is for the best. But Leibniz's most unique idea wasn't about God or evil. It was about the very nature of reality. This idea was monadology. Leibniz believed that everything in existence was made up of tiny, indivisible, immaterial units called monads. Unlike atoms, which are physical, monads exist as pure mind or energy, each reflecting the entire universe in its own way. Monads do not interact physically. They only appear to. What we think of as cause and effect is just monads unfolding according to their internal nature. Each monad contains its own built-in program set by God, which determines how it develops. This creates a pre-established harmony where everything happens in perfect synchrony without anything ever truly affecting anything else. Imagine a room full of clocks, all ticking in perfect harmony. They appear to be influencing one another, but in reality, each was set independently to move in perfect time. Leibniz argued that this is how the universe works. Every mind, every soul, every object is following its own internal order, yet somehow everything fits together into a perfectly arranged cosmos. Leibniz's philosophy was both brilliant and baffling. His vision of a predetermined, perfectly optimized universe influenced later debates about determinism, free will, and the nature of consciousness. His work helped shape modern logic, physics, and even artificial intelligence. But while Leibniz saw the universe as a perfectly ordered system, another philosopher shifted focus not on how reality is structured, but on how we experience it. From the preordained harmony of monads, we now turn to Edmund Husserl and the study of experience itself through phenomenology. Edmund Husserl, Phenomenology and the Study of Experience. What if the only thing we can ever truly know is our own experience? For Edmund Husserl, philosophy wasn't about abstract theories, invisible forces, or cosmic truths. It was about examining experience itself as directly as possible. Instead of asking what reality is made of, he asked how we experience reality, making him the father of phenomenology, the rigorous study of human perception and consciousness. Born in 1859, Husserl was dissatisfied with traditional philosophy, which he felt was too focused on objective facts and external reality. He wanted to develop a method that cut through assumptions and got to the core of how we experience the world. Husserl argued that we never experience the world directly. We only experience it through our consciousness. So instead of trying to determine what is really out there, he suggested a method called epoche, or bracketing. This means setting aside all assumptions about the external world. Instead of asking, "What is reality?" we ask, "How does reality appear to me?" By suspending judgment about the objective world, we can focus purely on the structures of our own perception. For example, when you see a chair, you don't just see an object made of wood, you experience chairness, a set of perceptions, expectations, and associations that make it a chair in your mind. Husserl wanted to analyze these layers of experience with scientific precision. One of Husserl's most important insights was intentionality, the idea that consciousness is always about something. You never just think, you think about something. You never just see, you see an object, a color, a shape. You never just feel, you feel happy, anxious, cold, or warm. This means that consciousness is not a passive receiver of information. It is always active, shaping and structuring experience. His work influenced existentialism, cognitive science, and psychology. Thinkers like Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty built upon his ideas, exploring the deeper connections between experience, existence, and meaning. But while Husserl explored how we experience reality, another thinker took a different approach, arguing that behind every experience, behind every moment of consciousness, there was something deeper, being itself. From the study of perception, we now turn to Martin Heidegger and the question of existence. Martin Heidegger, the question of existence and the search for being. What if the most important question in philosophy wasn't about knowledge, morality, or truth, but about being itself? For Martin Heidegger, most of Western philosophy had overlooked its most fundamental question: what does it mean to exist? While thinkers before him focused on reason, ethics, and perception, Heidegger believed these were secondary concerns. Before we ask anything else, we must first ask, what does it mean to be? Born in Germany in 1889, Heidegger was profoundly influenced by Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, but took it in a radically new direction. Instead of just studying how we experience the world, he wanted to uncover what it means to be in the world at all. His masterpiece, Being and Time, was a groundbreaking attempt to answer this question, and it reshaped the course of modern philosophy. Heidegger rejected the idea that human beings are just rational minds observing reality. He argued that our existence is always active, engaged, and situated within the world. To capture this, he introduced the term Dasein, which translates roughly to being there or existence. Dasein, as Heidegger described it, is not a detached thinker floating outside reality. It is a being fully immersed in the world, always engaged, always interacting. We do not simply observe reality from a distance. We experience it firsthand, shaping it through our actions and being shaped by it in return. Our identity is not something fixed or predetermined. It unfolds over time, evolving through our choices, relationships, and experiences. Existence is not an abstract concept to be analyzed from afar. It is something we are always in the middle of, navigating moment by moment. Heidegger also argued that we do not enter the world on our own terms. Instead, we are thrown into existence, arriving in a time, place, and culture we never chose. We inherit a language we did not create, traditions we did not invent, and social expectations that shape our understanding of ourselves and others. No choice we make is entirely free from these influences. Every decision, every belief, every action is shaped by the world we find ourselves in. This idea, which he called Geworfenheit, or in English thrownness, means that we are never fully in control of our lives. We start the game already in progress, and we must make sense of it as best we can. Because we are thrown into the world, most people simply go along with it. They live according to social norms, expectations, and routines without ever questioning them. Heidegger called this fallenness, a state where people live inauthentically, following the crowd rather than confronting their own existence. But true authenticity, he argued, requires facing the fundamental uncertainty of life. We must confront the fact that we will die, that life has no built-in meaning, and that we alone must define our existence. This confrontation leads to angst, a deep existential anxiety about the sheer openness and unpredictability of being. But for Heidegger, this wasn't something to fear. It was a call to live fully, to take responsibility for our existence, and to create meaning rather than passively inherit it. His ideas shaped existentialism, psychology, and postmodern philosophy. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus took his ideas in different directions, exploring freedom, absurdity, and the struggle for meaning. But while Heidegger explored the experience of being through philosophy, another thinker sought it through a different path, not through reason, but through direct spiritual experience. From the existential weight of existence, we now turn to Meister Eckhart and the mystical pursuit of the divine spark within. Meister Eckhart, Christian mysticism and the divine spark. What if the path to God wasn't through rituals, obedience, or scripture, but through silence, surrender, and direct experience? For Meister Eckhart, God wasn't some distant being ruling over creation. God was already within us, hidden in the deepest part of our soul. The task of spirituality, he believed, wasn't to follow external rules, but to awaken to this divine spark inside. Born in 1260, Eckhart was a German theologian and mystic who challenged conventional religious thinking. At a time when the Church emphasized doctrine, hierarchy, and obedience, Eckhart taught that the ultimate truth of God could not be contained in words. Instead, he preached a radical idea: to truly find God, one must let go of everything, even the idea of God itself. Eckhart believed that most people's relationship with God was clouded by ego, attachment, and desire. Instead of truly surrendering to the divine, they worshipped an image of God shaped by their own expectations. His solution: complete detachment. Let go of personal wants, fears, and ambitions. Let go of rigid beliefs about God and heaven. Let go of even the desire for salvation. Only in this state of pure openness could the soul awaken to what Eckhart called the divine spark, the part of us that is already one with God. One of Eckhart's most profound teachings was that God is constantly being born in the soul. Just as Jesus was born into the world, he believed that the divine is born within each of us, over and over again. This was not something that happened through ritual or prayer. It happened when a person became empty enough to receive God fully. To Eckhart, this was the essence of Christian mysticism. Not believing in God, but experiencing God. Not seeking divine rewards, but dissolving into divine presence. Not grasping at heaven, but realizing that heaven is already here. Eckhart's ideas were deeply controversial. The Church feared that his mystical approach undermined traditional authority and doctrine. If God was already within, what need was there for priests and sacraments? If heaven was here and now, what was the purpose of the afterlife? If letting go of God was the way to find God, where did that leave the Church's teachings? In 1326, Eckhart was accused of heresy and put on trial. Though he defended himself, he died before the verdict was issued. After his death, some of his teachings were condemned, but his ideas continued to influence mystics, philosophers, and even modern psychology. His ideas influenced later Christian mystics, Buddhist thought, and existential philosophy. His teachings on detachment resonate with Zen Buddhism, while his view of God as a formless presence echoes ideas in Sufism and Hinduism. But while Eckhart sought a direct, mystical experience of the divine, another thinker took a more structured approach, arguing that reason, logic, and natural law were the true paths to understanding God. From the mystical emptiness of Eckhart, we now turn to Thomas Aquinas and the rational foundation of faith. Thomas Aquinas, Natural Law and the 5 Ways to Prove God. What if faith and reason weren't enemies, but 2 paths leading to the same truth? For Thomas Aquinas, belief in God wasn't just a matter of faith, it was something that could be proven through reason, logic, and careful observation of the natural world. While many religious thinkers saw philosophy as a threat to faith, Aquinas believed that rational thought could strengthen religious belief rather than weaken it. Born in 1225, Aquinas lived at a time when Christian theology was deeply influenced by faith and divine revelation. But he was also deeply inspired by Aristotle, whose writings on logic, ethics, and nature had been rediscovered in Europe. Aquinas saw an opportunity to bring these 2 worlds together, to use reason to defend and explain Christian belief. His greatest work, Summa Theologica, became one of the most influential texts in Western philosophy and theology, shaping debates on ethics, politics, and law for centuries. Aquinas argued that God's existence could be demonstrated logically, not through blind faith, but through reason. He offered 5 ways to prove that a higher power must exist. 1. The argument from motion. Everything in motion must have been set in motion by something else. If we follow this chain backward, there must be a first mover, God. 2. The argument from cause. Every effect has a cause, but the chain of causes cannot go on forever. There must be a first cause, God. 3. The argument from contingency. Everything in existence is contingent. It could either exist or not exist. Since something cannot come from nothing, there must be a necessary being, God, who sustains existence itself. 4. The argument from degree. We judge things as good, better, or best. There must be a perfect ultimate standard of goodness, God. 5. The argument from design. The natural world is full of order, complexity, and purpose. This suggests an intelligent designer, God. These arguments, though rooted in medieval philosophy, continue to be debated in modern theology, science, and metaphysics. Beyond proving God's existence, Aquinas believed that moral laws weren't just divine commands, they were built into the fabric of reality itself. This idea, called natural law, holds that the universe operates according to a rational structure. Human beings, through reason, can discover moral truths by observing nature and human behavior. Right and wrong are not arbitrary, but grounded in the very order of existence. For Aquinas, morality wasn't just about obeying religious teachings, it was about living in harmony with the rational order of the universe. This idea would later influence human rights, ethics, and political philosophy, shaping the foundation of Western legal systems. Perhaps Aquinas' greatest contribution was bridging the gap between philosophy and religion. He argued that faith and reason were not opposed but complementary. Faith reveals divine truths that reason alone cannot reach. Reason helps clarify, refine, and defend those truths. A true understanding of God requires both. Unlike mystics like Meister Eckhart, who sought direct experience of the divine, Aquinas believed that careful study, logic, and debate were the best paths to understanding God. His ideas shaped Catholic theology, Western philosophy, and even secular ethics. His influence can be seen in modern legal theory, discussions on morality, and debates on science and religion. Even today, his 5 ways continue to be referenced in arguments for and against the existence of God. But while Aquinas saw a rational, ordered world that pointed toward a divine creator, another thinker took a radically different view, arguing that the existence of God could be proven not by observation, but by pure logic alone. From Aquinas' fusion of reason and faith, we now turn to Anselm of Canterbury and the most ambitious proof of God ever attempted, the ontological argument. Anselm of Canterbury, the ontological argument for God's existence. What if proving God's existence didn't require science, scripture, or even experience, but pure logic alone? For Anselm of Canterbury, belief in God wasn't just a matter of faith or observation. God's existence, he argued, could be proven through reason alone by thinking deeply about the very definition of God. His famous ontological argument attempted to do something no philosopher before him had done, prove the existence of God without relying on physical evidence, scripture, or cause-and-effect reasoning. Born in 1033, Anselm was a medieval theologian and philosopher whose ideas would ignite centuries of debate. His work shaped both Christian theology and modern philosophy, inspiring thinkers from René Descartes to Immanuel Kant. Anselm's argument started with a simple question: what is God? He defined God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, the greatest possible being. Then he made this bold claim: even an atheist can imagine the idea of God, the greatest possible being. If God exists only in the mind, then we can imagine something greater, a God that exists in reality. But by definition, God is the greatest possible being. Therefore, God must exist in reality, because a God that exists is greater than a God that does not. In other words, denying God's existence creates a contradiction. If we can conceive of a perfect being, but that being doesn't exist, then it wouldn't actually be perfect. Therefore, God must exist. Anselm's argument is unique because it doesn't rely on nature, morality, or cause and effect. Instead, it tries to prove God's existence using logic alone by showing that denying God's existence is irrational. But this raises a major problem. Just because we can imagine something doesn't mean it exists. By this logic, could we define anything into existence? Could we prove unicorns or perfect islands exist simply by imagining them? Anselm's reasoning was immediately challenged by Gaunilo of Marmoutiers, a fellow monk. Gaunilo used a parody argument to attack Anselm's logic. He argued, imagine a perfect island, the greatest island that can possibly exist. By Anselm's reasoning, this island must exist in reality, because an island that exists is greater than one that doesn't. But this is absurd. We know perfect islands don't just pop into existence. Anselm countered that his argument only applies to God, because only God is a necessary being. An island or any other object is contingent. It could exist or not exist. But God, by definition, must exist. Centuries later, René Descartes revived Anselm's argument, while philosophers like Immanuel Kant rejected it, arguing that existence is not a property like size or power. It cannot simply be part of a definition. Despite the controversy, Anselm's argument became one of the most influential proofs of God's existence. It laid the foundation for rational theology, modern logic, and metaphysical debates. Even today, philosophers still grapple with his reasoning, some defending it, others dismissing it as a clever trick of words. But while Anselm tried to prove God through pure logic, another thinker saw God not as a distant personal being, but as the very fabric of reality itself, inseparable from nature, existence, and the laws of the universe. From the rational proof of God's existence, we now turn to Baruch Spinoza and the radical idea that God and nature are one and the same. Baruch Spinoza, Pantheism, and God as nature. What if God wasn't a being watching over the universe, but the universe itself? For Baruch Spinoza, God wasn't a personal deity, separate from creation, intervening in human affairs. God was nature itself, the infinite, eternal, all-encompassing reality. To understand the universe was to understand God, and to live wisely was to accept our place within this vast, interconnected whole. Born in 1632 to a Jewish family in Amsterdam, Spinoza's ideas were so radical that he was excommunicated from his own community. His rejection of traditional religion, his denial of free will, and his belief in a purely rational universe made him one of the most controversial thinkers of his time. But centuries later, his work influenced scientists, philosophers, and even Albert Einstein, who once said, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the lawful harmony of the world." Spinoza's central idea was pantheism, the belief that God is not a separate supernatural entity, but is identical with the universe itself. He argued that everything in existence is part of a single, infinite substance, God. But this God is not a separate creator standing outside the universe. Instead, God is the universe itself, inseparable from nature and all that exists. The laws of nature are not divine commands issued from above. They are simply the expression of God's very essence, woven into the fabric of reality itself. This meant that everything from the motion of planets to human emotions is part of the same unified reality. There is no supernatural intervention, no miracles, no divine judgment, only the unfolding of nature's laws. One of Spinoza's most controversial claims was his denial of free will. He believed that everything in existence follows strict causal laws, leaving no room for true freedom of choice. People may feel as if they are making independent decisions, but in reality their thoughts, desires, and actions are shaped by prior causes beyond their control. Just as a stone thrown into the air follows a predetermined path dictated by the laws of physics, human beings follow the natural laws of cause and effect, moving through life not as free agents but as part of an unbroken chain of necessity. To Spinoza, freedom was not about making choices, it was about understanding the necessity of things. The more we accept that our lives are shaped by natural laws, the more at peace we become. Instead of resisting the natural order, Spinoza believed that true wisdom and happiness came from understanding and embracing it. Rather than praying for things to change, we should seek to understand why things happen. Rather than fearing death, we should recognize that we are part of something eternal. Rather than clinging to ego and desires, we should strive for intellectual and emotional clarity. This was a philosophy not of control, but of surrender. To see the world as Spinoza did was to let go of illusions, accept reality as it is, and find peace in the fact that everything unfolds exactly as it must. His ideas influenced modern science, psychology, and secular philosophy. He laid the groundwork for rationalism, determinism, and even early atheism. His rejection of supernaturalism shaped later thinkers like Nietzsche, Einstein, and modern secular humanists. But while Spinoza saw reality as an unchanging necessary order, another philosopher argued that truth is not fixed. It is something that emerges through radical breaks, upheavals, and revolutionary moments. From the eternal harmony of nature, we now turn to Alain Badiou and the transformative power of truth and events. Alain Badiou, Truth, Events, and Revolutionary Change. What if everything you believe to be true is just a repetition of the past, and real truth only emerges in moments of radical break? For Alain Badiou, truth is not something we passively discover. It is something that erupts, disrupts, and forces us to rethink everything. Whether in science, politics, love, or art, Badiou argued that history is shaped by rare, transformative events, moments where something truly new enters the world. Those who recognize these moments and remain faithful to them become agents of change, while those who cling to old ideas become prisoners of the past. Born in 1937, Badiou lived through war, political revolutions, and the rise of global capitalism. He rejected the idea that the world simply moves forward in a linear way. Instead, he believed that true progress happens in unpredictable ruptures when people break free from old systems and redefine what is possible. At the core of Badiou's philosophy is the event, a moment that shatters the existing order and introduces a new possibility. In politics, a revolution is an event. It rewrites history and creates new political truths. In science, Einstein's theory of relativity was an event. It changed how we understand the universe. In love, meeting someone who transforms your world is an event. It alters your very sense of self. In art, the rise of modernism was an event. It broke from past traditions and created new forms of expression. An event is not just a change. It is a radical rupture. It is something unexpected, undeniable, and irreversible. Once an event happens, the world cannot go back to the way it was before. For Badiou, truth is not a fixed thing, waiting to be found. It is something that is created by those who recognize an event and stay loyal to it. A scientist who builds on Einstein's work and expands the field of physics is part of the event of relativity. A revolutionary who fights for justice long after the initial uprising is part of the event of political change. An artist who follows a radical new vision instead of copying old styles is part of the event of artistic innovation. To live authentically, Badiou argued, one must be faithful to an event, to recognize when something truly new has happened and commit to its consequences, even when the world resists. Badiou believed that modern society resists true change. Governments, media, and institutions try to make us believe that history is over, that nothing truly new can happen, and that the world will always be the same. But this, he argued, is a lie. Events will always come. Truth will always break through, and the people who recognize these moments will be the ones who shape the future. His ideas have influenced political theory, art, mathematics, and activism. His call for philosophy as a force of radical change continues to inspire thinkers who believe that the world is not static, that it can be reshaped, redefined, and reimagined. From Socrates to Badiou, from ethics to existentialism, from logic to revolution, we have traveled through the minds that shaped human thought. But philosophy does not end here. The questions continue, the ideas evolve, and new thinkers emerge, each daring to challenge the past, each reshaping how we see ourselves in the universe. Every great philosopher was once just a person with a question. And maybe the next world-changing idea won't come from the past, it could come from you. So what ideas will shape the future? What philosophy resonates most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. If you've enjoyed this journey through philosophy, leave a like to help more people discover these ideas. And if you want to keep exploring the depths of human thought, subscribe for more content like this. After all, the search for wisdom never truly ends.